Tonight, we travel to Novgorod upon the Volkhov, in the winter of 1392. It is the year 1392, deep in the Russian winter. On the right bank of the frozen Volkhov River, within the trading quarter of Novgorod, stands the Peterhof, a walled compound where German merchants from Lübeck, Bremen and Visby reportedly lived for nearly 2 centuries. The gates are locked for the night. Inside, the alderman counts the last candles. Outside, snow drifts against the stockade, and the bells of St. Peter's Chapel ring for compline. You are among the 40 men permitted to winter here. You are standing at the frozen edge of the Volkhov River, where the first pale light of winter dawn touches the smoke of 10,000 chimneys. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the particular silence of a city built entirely of wood, muffled by snow. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from sledges that have creaked through the night from the Baltic shore, and the crack of river ice, expanding in the cold, like distant gunfire, echoes between the timber walls of the trade side and the Sofia side. The Volkhov River divided Novgorod into 2 parts, the trade side on one bank and the Sofia side on the other, where the great cathedral lifts its dome against the whitening sky. The Republic of Novgorod existed from the 12th to the 15th century, and this morning you feel the weight of those centuries in the frozen mud beneath your boots, in the layered smoke of generations of hearths burning pine and fir and birch. The city's name, Novgorod, means new city in Old East Slavic, though by 1392 it was already centuries old, a wooden city renewed through constant rebuilding as rot and fire regularly demanded replacement of structures. You walk with the German merchants from Visby toward the Peterhof, its location on the trade side placing it adjacent to the main market square where the day's commerce will soon begin. The Hanseatic presence in Novgorod predates the formal contour system of the 13th century, with German merchants first appearing in Novgorod records in the late 12th century. But this morning, a man from Visby watches from the Peterhof gate with particular attention, noting which boyars attend the gathering crowd. His breath crystallizes on his beard, and you notice how snow squeaks under boots at 30 below, how the metallic taste of melted snow water, the only safe drink, still lingers from your morning cup. The dense, sweet-foul smell of stacked pelts in the warehouse reaches you even here. Fox, sable, marten, the wealth of northern forests that Novgorod controlled and traded across the known world. The Veche assembly governed Novgorod from at least the 12th century onward, and this morning its bell sounds from Yaroslav's court, a deep bronze voice that competes across the river with the iron clapper of a German chapel. Church bells competing across the river, orthodox sonorous bronze, German iron clapper, each calling its faithful to different duties, different loyalties, different heavens. Yet the citizens gather for a commercial dispute, not a religious one, and the Veche bell draws them through streets narrow as forest paths, between houses whose overhanging second stories nearly touch above the frozen ruts. You move with the crowd, feeling the press of bodies wrapped in sheepskin and fur, the collective breath rising in clouds that catch the dawn light like low fog. Novgorod's population in the medieval period is estimated at 10,000,015,000, and on market mornings, the city would have seemed to contain much of that population at once, jostling toward the square where justice and commerce intertwined. The Posadnik served as mayor or governor, typically elected by the Veche, and this morning you may see him emerge from the timber hall with his fur-trimmed cloak marking office to address the assembly on matters of trade and trespass. The German merchant from Visby, whose name you do not yet know, continues his watch from the Peterhof gate. He notes which boyars attend, which factions of the great trading families have sent their sons or their stewards, which alliances might shift with the season's final cargoes. Foreign merchants were restricted to specific quarters and trading seasons, and as the trading year neared its end, The Volkhov would freeze further each night, until navigation became difficult or impossible, forcing the Germans to retreat to their winter quarters or risk being stranded until spring. He counts his companions mentally, checks his memory of the Schra book where their agreements are recorded, calculates whether this dispute will delay the final loading of his sledge train. The crowd thickens around Yaroslav's court, and you find yourself pressed against the rough-hewn wall of a warehouse where tallow and beeswax candles, their smoke blackening the low timber ceilings, have left their greasy residue on every surface. The building's timbers are barely a decade old, Novgorod's wooden architecture requiring constant renewal. Yet already the soot has worked into the grain, already the pine resin weeps from joints, stressed by summer humidity and winter contraction. You place your gloved hand against the wall and feel the vibration of the Veche bell through the frozen wood, through the frozen earth, through the frozen city that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains in nominal authority, if not in daily reach. The Archbishop of Novgorod held significant political power alongside the Veche, and this morning his steward moves through the crowd in episcopal purple, collecting whispers, distributing nods, preparing the ground for whatever position his master will take in the dispute. The city was formerly subordinate to the Grand Prince of Vladimir, though it often operated with considerable autonomy, and the Archbishop's influence may have derived partly from his role in managing that delicate relationship, negotiating between distant sovereignty and immediate local need. You watch him pause to speak with a fur trader whose warehouse you passed earlier, the dense, sweet foul smell of stacked pelts still clinging to the man's sleeves, and you understand how commerce and ecclesiastical power intertwine in this republic, where no single hand holds the reins. Novgorod's wealth derived from its position on the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a route that ran south along the Volkhov to Lake Ilmen, to the Lovat, to the Dnieper and the Black Sea to Constantinople, and north to the Neva, to the Gulf of Finland, to the Baltic and the trading networks of the Hanseatic League. The city controlled access to the fir-rich forests of northern Russia, and the pelts that scent this morning's air will travel both routes, will warm the shoulders of boyars in Vladimir and merchants in Lubeck, will purchase silver that flowed through Novgorod from trade routes, will accumulate in treasuries where Novgorod minted its own silver coinage, the grivna, to standardize and simplify the endless exchange. The Veche bell falls silent. The crowd presses closer to the open space before Yaroslav's court, and you find a position where you can see the raised platform where the Posadnik will speak. Snow squeaks under boots at 30 below, and you shift your weight to keep circulation moving in your frozen toes, grateful for the sheepskin lining of your boots, for the wool layers that trap your body's warmth against the killing cold. The metallic taste of melted snow water, the only safe drink, returns to your memory as you watch a servant carry a steaming bucket toward the platform, the Posadnik's morning drink, heated over a brazier in the hall's inner chamber. He emerges now, the Posadnik, his fur-trimmed cloak marking office, the sable dark against the pale wool of his undergarments, the heavy girdle of his authority catching the low winter light. The crowd murmurs and settles, a sound like wind through bare branches, and he raises his hand in greeting or in command. You are standing close enough to see the frost crystals on his eyebrows, the careful neutrality of his expression as he surveys the assembled citizens, the German merchant from Visby watching from the Peterhof gate, the Archbishop's steward in his calculated position near the platform's edge. The dispute concerns a cargo of wax. You learn from the murmured explanations around you. Wax purchased in the autumn market by a Novgorod trader now accused of using false weights, of selling his own inferior product while retaining the German merchant's quality goods. The Novgorod Judicial Charter, the city's commercial law code, dates to the 15th century, but it built upon principles that were already deeply rooted in long-established trading practices. The German merchant from Visby, whose name you still do not know, watches with particular attention as the accused trader speaks in his own defense, his voice carrying the nasal intonations of the northern lake country, the region where Novgorod's territory stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains in its furthest claims. The merchant notes which boyars attend, which of the great families have sent representatives to observe, which alliances might be tested or confirmed by the Veche's judgment. His fingers move unconsciously against his belt, where a small leather pouch contains his tally sticks, his record of transactions completed and pending, his material memory of a trading season now nearing its close. You listen to the arguments as the sun clears the cathedral dome across the river, its light pale and weak, offering more visibility than warmth. The crack of river ice expanding in the cold, like distant gunfire, punctuates the speeches at irregular intervals, a natural counterpoint to the human voices, the bronze bells, the iron clapper. The particular silence of a city built entirely of wood, muffled by snow, returns between these sounds, a hush that seems to gather the cold around it, to deepen the stillness of frozen air, frozen water, frozen earth. The Posadnik allows each party to speak fully, his fur-trimmed cloak marking office even as his posture relaxes slightly, suggesting patience rather than urgency. Novgorod's tradition of careful deliberation in its assemblies reflects a history of negotiating autonomy with powerful neighbors, including eventual submission to the Golden Horde, a pragmatic approach to preserving the city's essential freedom through tactical compliance. The city's motto, inscribed on its seal, proclaimed its reliance on divine protection. Lord, save thy city and thy people, and this prayer reflects the intertwining of religious and secular life, the divine invocation that framed governance in this community of traders, priests, and boyars. The morning wears toward noon. The crowd shifts and settles, bodies conserving warmth through minimal movement. You feel the cold reaching through your layers now, the persistent mathematics of heat transfer that governs all winter existence here. The judgment comes as the sun reaches its brief apex, a division of the disputed wax, a fine for the false weights, a warning against future deception. The crowd murmurs its acceptance, neither enthusiastic nor resistant, the sound of a community that has witnessed such resolutions 1,000 times before, that trusts the process, if not always the particular outcome. The German merchant from Visby relaxes his posture slightly, his observation of which boyars attend now complete, his mental notes stored for later transcription into the Schra book, where his community records its collective experience of this foreign place. You drift with the dispersing crowd, finding yourself again at the Peterhof gate as the German merchant completes his own departure, his day's observation done. Evening approaches early in this northern winter, the sun already descending toward the cathedral dome, the light taking on the blue quality of deep cold. The Volkhov freezes further. You can see the ice extending from both banks toward the center, the dark water narrowing daily, the trading year ending in visible physical form. The city maintained permanent trading relations with the Baltic from at least the 9th century. Yet each winter this relationship must pause, must wait for the spring thaw, the reopening of water routes, the renewal of contact after months of isolation. The German merchant closes the gate behind him, checks the Schra book by the last daylight in the Peterhof's entrance chamber, counts his companions as they return from their own observations, their own transactions, their own negotiations with this city that is formally subordinate to the Grand Prince of Vladimir, but effectively autonomous in all that matters to their trade. The Novgorod birch bark documents, written in Old Novgorod dialect, survive from the 11th century, and you imagine such documents in this chamber, records of earlier German presence, Earlier disputes, earlier accommodations between different peoples drawn together by commerce across the frozen distances. Night falls. The Volkhov freezes further, the ice now meeting in the river's center, the dark water confined to narrow channels that will soon close entirely. The trading year nears its end, and the German merchants' tally sticks speak of cargoes still to move, of deadlines pressing against the advancing ice, of calculations that must be completed before the final sledges depart for the Baltic shore. You stand at the frozen edge of the river where you began this morning, the first pale light now replaced by the first pale stars, the smoke of 10,000 chimneys rising into a sky that seems to gather the cold and hold it, to press it down upon this wooden city, this republic of traders, this Novgorod that means simply new city in old East Slavic, though it contains centuries of layered living. The church bells begin their evening competition across the river. The Orthodox sonorous bronze from the Sophia side, the German iron clapper from the trade side where you stand, each calling its faithful to evening prayer, to evening rest, to the warmth of enclosed spaces where tallow and beeswax candles, their smoke blackening the low timber ceilings, will provide the only light against the long northern dark. You walk now through streets emptying of daylight commerce, the frozen ruts gleaming faintly under starlight and the occasional torch. Snow squeaks under boots at 30 below, and you feel the crystallization of your own breath in your beard, the small transformation of body warmth into ice that marks all existence here. The Peterhof's windows glow with German candlelight, the Schra book still open somewhere within, the final calculations of the season proceeding in a script precise and foreign. The German merchant from Visby has noted which boyars attend, has counted his companions, has prepared his departure with the methodical patience that this climate demands, this commerce requires, this city of Novgorod rewards in those who understand its rhythms. The cold deepens. The stars sharpen in a sky that seems to descend toward the chimneys, toward the frozen earth, toward the river that is now nearly solid from bank to bank. The Volkhov River divided Novgorod into two parts, the trade side and the Sophia side, and tonight that division is being healed by cold, by ice, by the universal stillness that descends when commerce pauses, and the city turns inward toward its own warmth, its own memories, its own dreams of spring. You find a doorway, a passage, a place where the particular silence of a city built entirely of wood, muffled by snow, gathers you into its protection. The city's motto, inscribed on its seal, proclaimed its freedom. Lord, save thy city and thy people, and this prayer seems to hang in the frozen air tonight, not spoken but present, the underlying vibration of a republic that has learned to survive through patience, through negotiation, through the wisdom of wooden walls and frozen rivers, and the long dark between autumn market and spring thaw. The last light fades from the Peterhof's windows. The German merchant has closed his accounts, checked his companions, prepared for the final departure that tomorrow or the next day will take him through frozen forests toward the sea, toward Visby, toward the continuation of a presence that predates the formal contour system of the 13th century, that first appears in Novgorod records in the late 12th century, that will persist as long as there is profit in fur and wax and the exchange of distant goods. You stand in the cold that is now complete, the night that is now total, the silence that is now absolute except for the occasional settling of timber, the occasional whisper of snow against snow, the occasional distant bell that marks the hours of a darkness that will last, until morning brings only a brief pale interruption before the long night returns. The cold moves across your face. The smoke of distant chimneys rises in straight columns toward the stars, the air too still to disturb them. You breathe the frozen air, taste the metallic memory of melted snow water, feel the weight of sheepskin and wool that separates your living warmth from the infinite cold beyond. The Republic of Novgorod, November of the year 1392. The Volkhov freezes further. The trading year nears its end. And the city holds its breath, waiting for spring, waiting for the return of open water and foreign merchants, and the assembly's bronze bell calling the free citizens to gather once more beside the flowing river, beneath the changing sky, within the wooden walls that constant renewal maintains against the slow patience of northern time. The ice on the Trav cracks along its seams as March sunlight lengthens across the mudflats of Lübeck. You are standing at the quayside before dawn, watching torches move between the cogs that wallow in the narrowing channel. The harbour master has declared the river open, and the first convoy of the year prepares for the long passage eastward. Around you, the stevedores sing their rhythmic songs as they lower casks of Rhenish wine into the hold of a broad-beamed cog that has wintered in the shallows. The vessel reeks of tar and oakum, of salt pork and dried peas, of the fermented reek that will deepen with every week the voyage endures. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks connected the Baltic to the Black Sea from at least the 9th century, and you trace its northern branch now. Merchants travelled in armed convoys, the unsell, for protection against pirates and princes, and this morning 12 cogs will sail together under the command of a convoy master elected from among the merchants themselves. The Artlenberg privilege of 1161, granted by Henry the Lion, mentions German traders in Novgorod, and you carry a copy of those privileges folded in your travelling chest, the wax seal softened by the warmth of your cabin. The sailing season from Lübeck to Novgorod lasted roughly May to October, though the bold or the desperate might push earlier, trusting to fortune and the ice saints of April. You watch the helmsman test the tiller while the captain argues with a provisioner over the quality of dried stockfish. The Artlenberg Treaty guaranteed German merchants protection and reduced tolls in Russian lands, yet the guarantee required presence, required the annual arrival of these hulls heavy with Western goods. A voyage from Lübeck to Novgorod typically took 3 to 4 weeks with favourable winds, and the favourable winds were never guaranteed. The cog's single square sail, dyed a faded ochre, stirs and collapses as the offshore breeze finds and loses it. The island of Gotland lay equidistant between the Swedish mainland and the Baltic states, and upon that island, its harbour town Visby served as the critical intermediate station between Novgorod and Western Europe. The anchor rises dripping through the brown water of the Trav, and the cog falls away from the quay with the reluctance of a waking animal. You feel the deck shift beneath your feet, the first true motion of the season. The other vessels of the Unsell spread across the widening estuary, their sails catching the morning light like pale flames against the dark woods of the Holstein shore. The shudder of a cog grounding on a sandbar, the desperate bailing, these are the memories that seasoned merchants carry, and you watch the leadsman in the bow call his depths with the practiced indifference of one who has heard the bottom rise and fall 1,000 times. The water deepens, the channel widens, and the last church spires of Lübeck dissolve into the haze of distance as the Baltic opens before you in its vast indifference to human purpose. The second day brings fog that erases horizon and sky, and you stand at the rail watching the lead drop and vanish, the only rhythm in the grey world. The particular green of the Baltic in May has given way to this milk-white nothing, and the convoy shortens its intervals, each cog keeping the stern lantern of its leader in sight, like a moth tracking flame. Around you, the merchants play at dice, below deck or pace, the narrow planks with the restless energy of men who have surrendered control to wind and water. The hold's fermented reek after 6 weeks is still a distant promise, but already the bilge speaks of its future, and you breathe through your mouth when the wind drops and the stench rises. The fog lifts on the 4th morning with the theatrical suddenness of the northern latitudes. You are standing at the rail at dawn, the light falling across a sea transformed. The particular green of the Baltic in May returns in full, and you can see the sandy bottom through 15 fathoms of water, the light penetrating to reveal forests of kelp swaying in the invisible currents. The convoy has drifted north of its intended track, and the helmsman studies the sun with a bale of linstocks, while the captain consults his rutters, those closely guarded manuscripts that record soundings and landmarks in the cipher of each master. The Dago beacon appears at noon, a cairn of stones on a rocky islet that marks the passage from open sea to the Gotland Channel. The veteran helmsman marks the sequence: the Dago beacon, the Osmasar shallows, the Never Delta, and you listen as he instructs the younger men in the litany of hazards that separate Lübeck from the Russian shore. The wind holds steady from the southwest, and the cogs make good their lost distance. You sleep in short watches now, the deck your pillow, the sails thunder your lullaby. The tar and oakum, the salt pork and dried peas, these are the constants of your existence, the flavors of salt and smoke that cling to your fingers and your clothes. A merchant from Cologne shares your watch, and he speaks of the Flemish cloth in the hold, the bales he has personally inspected in the workshops of Ypres, the dyes that will fade or hold their color in the different light of the eastern markets. The Gotlandic rune stones commemorate merchants who died in the east, and you have seen such stones in the churchyards of your own country, the inscriptions worn to shadows by the patience of northern weather. The cliffs of Gotland rise from the southern horizon on the 12th day, a line of white against the darker white of the sky. You are standing at the rail at dawn, the harbour still hours distant, and the gulls that accompany the convoy have multiplied, their cries announcing land to ears that have forgotten the sound. The island's position made it inevitable as a stopping place, a point of exchange between the goods of the west and the goods of the east. Gotland, with its harbour town Visby, served as the critical intermediate station between Novgorod and Western Europe, and you feel the relief that all travellers feel when the empty passage yields to the promise of shelter and society. The convoy rounds Gotland, puts in at Visby for provisions and news from the east. You watch the limestone warehouses of the harbour approach, the only stone architecture a Novgorod-bound merchant sees for months, and the sight surprises you with its solidity after the wooden impermanence of Lübeck and the cogs. German merchants established themselves on Gotland by the mid-12th century, and their descendants still dominate the trade, though the island retains its own laws, its own assembly, its own stubborn identity, apart from the German cities that now overshadow it. Visby's stone ring wall, built in the 13th century, enclosed what had been the most cosmopolitan city in the Baltic, and you pass beneath its towers with the small awe that stone always inspires in those who live among wood. The cog ties to a wharf where the water runs clear over white sand, and you step ashore with the unsteady gait of men who have forgotten the immobility of land. Around you, the merchants supervise the Gotlandic stevedores who perform the labour with the practiced efficiency of a port that has handled such transfers for 300 years. The cold air moves across your face, but it carries now the warmth of sun on stone, the particular quality of southern exposure that makes Visby a garden in the brief intensity of the northern summer. You walk through streets where the languages of 4 nations compete in the commerce of the morning, where a merchant from Bruges argues toll rates with a factor from Riga, while a Gotlandic housewife sells him bread in the dialect of the island. The news from Novgorod arrives with the last cogs of the previous autumn, with letters carried overland from the Narva crossing, with the gossip of harbour taverns where wine loosens tongues that silence has bound through winter. The Gotlandic community in Novgorod predated the formal Hanseatic contour, and you seek out a Gotlandic merchant who maintains his own connections, independent of the German organization that now dominates the eastern trade. Visby merchants maintain their own trading house in Novgorod, separate from later German contours, and this independence, this residual identity, offers possibilities that the more regulated German merchants cannot access. You drink small beer in a courtyard where roses climb the limestone walls, and the merchant speaks of prices, of political dangers, of the Grand Prince's latest demands for tribute in silver or furs. The stay in Visby lasts 6 days, time enough to reprovision, to repair the small damages of the passage, to arrange the final distribution of goods among the cogs that will continue eastward, and those that will winter here or return westward, with Russian wax and amber, and the dried herbs of the forest. You examine your own vessel's hull at the beaching, watch the caulkers work oakum into the seams with their hooked tools, smell the fresh tar that seals the work against the deeper waters ahead. The convoy that departs Visby is smaller than the one that left Lübeck, 7 cogs instead of 12, the others dispersed to their various destinations along the Baltic shore. The particular green of the Baltic in May has warmed toward the deeper blue of June, and the sailing season from Lübeck to Novgorod lasted roughly May to October, so you ride now in the favorable middle of that window. The Osmasar shallows lie ahead, a submerged ridge that has claimed hulls in every generation, and the veteran helmsman repeats his litany with the variations that experience has taught him, the local knowledge that no rudder can fully capture. The Estonian coast passes to starboard, a low green line that offers no harbour of significance, no reason to delay the final push toward the Gulf of Finland. You stand at the rail watching the sun descend toward this same western horizon that you have followed since Lübeck, and the light extends across the water in a path of molten copper that seems to offer direct passage to the lands ahead. The gulls screaming over the fish-drying racks at the river mouth are still distant, still imagined, but the imagination grows more vivid as the distance shortens. The first mosquitoes of summer, rising in clouds from the delta marshes, are a discomfort you anticipate with something like pleasure, the proof of arrival in a landscape that the winter ice has made inaccessible. The Never Delta appears on the 20th day, a confusion of channels and islands that the helmsman reads with the intensity of a scholar confronting a difficult text. The veteran helmsman marks the passage. The Dago beacon, the Osmasar shallows, the Never Delta, and his voice has changed, has taken on the particular timbre of a man who approaches his destination after long absence, who speaks the names as invocation rather than navigation. Arrival at the mouth of the Volkhov. The crew unstep the mast to pass beneath the bridges. You watch the heavy timber lifted by block and tackle, the sail gathered and bound, the cog transformed from a sailing vessel to a floating hull dependent on oars and tow ropes. The first mosquitoes of summer find you now in earnest, and you wrap your face in oiled linen against their probing, against the welts they raise on every exposed surface. The bridges of Novgorod are low, built for the passage of carts and pedestrians, not for the masts of seagoing cogs. You watch the first bridge approach, a structure of squared logs that has been replaced and replaced again across the centuries, and feel the hull slow as the tow men on the bank take the strain of the rope. The river narrows as the city approaches, and the banks rise into the wooden architecture of a civilization that builds upward from the forest floor. You are standing at the rail, though the rail is lower now with the mast unstepped, and you watch the churches emerge from the riverine distance with the gradual revelation that characterizes all northern arrivals. First sight of Novgorod's churches, the 5 domes of St. Sophia, the needle of St. Boris and Gleb, and the sight arrests you with its foreignness, its assertion of a visual world that operates by different principles than the gabled towns of your origin. The domes are dark against the pale sky, their forms swollen and organic, their crosses catching the light with the particular reflectiveness of gilded copper. You have arrived at the terminus of the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, and the antiquity of this arrival, The accumulated weight of all previous arrivals presses upon you with the physical force of a hand upon your shoulder. The cog ties at the wharves of the German shore, the district where the foreign merchants dwell in summer, where the trading houses face the river with their warehouses below and their living quarters above. The hold's fermented reek after 6 weeks rises as the hatches open, and you accept this smell as the signature of your arrival, the proof that you have brought the West to the East in this most material of forms. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, the Flemish cloth and Rhenish wine that will clothe the boyars and grace the tables of the Archbishop's palace. The days that follow resolve into the patterns of the trading season, the negotiations and inspections, and the slow transfer of goods against goods, of silver against promises, of future delivery against present need. You walk through streets where the particular green of the Baltic in May exists only in memory, replaced by the dust of summer roads, by the green of birch and pine that frames every view of this wooden city. Visby's limestone warehouses have prepared you for the predominance of wood, yet the scale of Novgorod's wooden construction still surprises. The 4-story houses of the merchant quarter, the fortress churches that rise entirely from timbered walls. By the 13th century, Lübeck had superseded Visby as the organizing center of Novgorod trade, and you feel this supersession in the administrative arrangements that govern your stay, in the German contour that now regulates the foreign presence with the formal procedures of an organization that has outgrown its origins. The transition from merchant Hanse to city Hanse crystallized in the mid-14th century with the first general Hanseatic diets, and you are the inheritor of this crystallization, the representative not of yourself alone, but of a collective identity that your individual presence serves and confirms. The summer passes in the elongated days of the northern latitude, in the brief nights when sleep comes slowly, and the sounds of the city continue without interruption. The first mosquitoes of summer diminish as July advances, their season as brief and intense as everything else in this climate. You learn the routes through the city, the churches that offer shelter from rain or sun, the merchants whose credit is reliable, and those whose promises require collateral. The trading completed, the accounts settled, the remaining stockfish and wax and honey loaded in exchange for the Flemish cloth and Rhenish wine that have found their buyers, you prepare for the return passage. You stand at the rail as the cog departs the German shore, the mast stepped once more, the sail catching the wind that carries you westward. The 5 domes of St. Sophia, the needle of St. Boris and Gleb, diminish against the sky, and you carry the image of them as you carried the image of Visby's limestone warehouses as markers in the mental map of your journey. The river widens toward its mouth, and the bridges pass above with their low clearance no longer a concern. The veteran helmsman marks the passage in reverse now, the same landmarks in opposite order, and his voice has taken on the relaxed cadence of the homeward journey, the danger past, the profit secured, the winter waiting with its own slower rhythms of account and rest and preparation for the spring that will come, that always comes, that brings the ice to breaking and the cogs to the quayside, and the whole elaborate machinery of trade into motion once again. You settle into the routine of the return voyage, the watches and the meals, and the small negotiations of shared space that define life aboard the cog. The convoy has scattered, each master making his best speed with the wind that favors him, and you sail now with only 2 companions visible on the horizon, their sails like pale wings against the gathering darkness of the autumn sky. The direct passage saves days, and the days saved may mean the difference between a safe arrival and a wintering in some intermediate port, some half-familiar harbor where the expenses accumulate and the profit diminishes. The Trav appears at last, its mouth familiar after the strangeness of the Russian rivers, and you feel the particular relief of return to a known landscape, a known language, a known set of expectations and obligations. The cold air moves across your face, and it carries now the autumnal sense of fallen leaves and distant smoke, the presage of winter that has always been the true season of this northern world, the season that defines all others by contrast and anticipation. You are standing at the quayside at dawn, and the harbour is Lübeck, and the dawn is the same dawn that has risen on 1,000 such arrivals, the light falling across the same gabled roofs, the same church spires, the same mudflats where the tide reveals and conceals its own patient rhythm. The cog ties to the quay, and the unloading begins, the wax and the furs and the honey that will enter the warehouses of the German shore, that will find their way to the workshops of Flanders, to the tables of France, to the distant markets that the route from the Varangians to the Greeks has always served. The Volkhov freezes further. The trading year nears its end. The Volkhov moves past you with a steady, unhurried current, its surface catching the pale light of an autumn morning. You have come from Lübeck, from the organized streets and the salt warehouses, and the sound of church bells marking the hours of commerce. Now you wait to enter the Peterhof, the Peterhof, Curia Sancti Petri, the Hanseatic settlement that has taken shape on the right bank of the river, the trade side, adjacent to the Novgorod market, where Russian merchants spread their furs and wax and honey. The compound lies before you across a stretch of beaten earth, and you can see the wooden stockade that surrounds it, the controlled gates standing open for the day's business. This is one of 4 main Hanseatic contours, alongside those in London, Bruges and Bergen, and the term itself derives from French comptoir, meaning counting table or office. The contour system formalized in the late 13th century, though German presence in Novgorod was older, stretching back through decades of individual ventures and temporary lodgings to something more permanent, more regulated, more capable of sustaining the long rhythms of northern trade. The earliest documentary reference to a formal German court in Novgorod dates to the 1190s, and you are walking now across the threshold of that long evolution, from informal gathering to structured community. Fresh pine timber, newly cut for a warehouse roof, bleeds sap in the August heat that still lingers in this early autumn day. The smell rises around you as you pass beneath the gate, sweet and resinous, the wood not yet seasoned, still holding the life of the forest from which it was taken. Around you, the courtyard opens into a space of organized chaos, the summer bustle of the contour at its height, perhaps 200 Germans present from a dozen cities, their voices overlapping in dialects of Low German that shade one into another. Barrels roll across the packed earth, pushed by workers whose names you do not know. Bales of cloth from Flanders sit, stacked against the warehouse wall, waiting for the Russian buyers who will come with their sable and their squirrel pelts. The particular acoustic of this timber world surrounds you, intimate and resonant, no stone to absorb the sound, everything wooden, everything giving back a slightly hollow ring to voice and footfall. You are directed toward the meeting hall, a building of squared logs with a steep roof against the snows to come. Inside, the alderman sits at a long table, the elderman elected by the resident merchants to govern the Peterhof, to represent the community before the Posadnik and the Veche, the Russian authorities whose permission and whose forbearance make this settlement possible. He is a man from Lübeck, you are told, though he has lived here long enough to speak Russian with the unthinking fluency of habit. He looks up from a document as you enter, and you present your letters of introduction, the sealed papers that attest your membership in the merchant community, your right to trade under its protection. The alderman explains the rules that bind all who dwell within the Peterhof, Curia Sancti Petri, this compound on the right bank of the Volkhov. No private trade, he tells you, his voice even and unhurried. The goods must pass through the common accounts, the profits shared according to established portions, the risks likewise distributed. No Russian women within the stockade. The boundary must be maintained, the community kept distinct, the possibilities of conflict and complication reduced to manageable absence. No weapons at meetings. The decisions must be reached in deliberation, not enforced by threat. The merchants must govern themselves by consent and by the accumulated precedent of their shared practice. You listen, and you nod, and you understand that these rules are the architecture of survival, the framework that permits 200 men to live in proximity through the intensities of summer and the confinements of winter. Sawdust and wood shavings lie underfoot in the carpentry shop where you are shown next, the floor soft with the residue of continuous work. Here coffins and furniture are made, the necessary objects of a community that cannot rely on local craftsmen, that must supply its own needs from its own resources. A man from Cologne works at a bench, shaping the legs of a table, and you watch the curl of the plane as it lifts a thin ribbon from the surface. The shop smells of resin and of the oil used to treat the finished pieces, and the light falls through a single window in a solid shaft that illuminates the floating dust. The compound contained a church dedicated to St. Peter, warehouses, dwellings, and this meeting hall, and everywhere you look there is evidence of construction, of rebuilding, of the continuous labor that maintains a settlement in wood, where fire is the constant enemy and the buildings burn and are replaced across the centuries. The Church of St. Peter stands at the center of the Peterhof, the Petershof, and you enter it on the day of its consecration, a ceremony that gathers the whole community in their best garments, the imported cloth, the preserved finery of distant cities. The interior is plain, the walls unplastered, the timber showing its grain and its joins, and yet the particular acoustic of a timber church enfolds you, intimate and resonant, no stone to absorb the sound, so that the voices of the singers seem to come from everywhere at once, to fill the space without direction or source. A Cologne goldsmith has contributed a chalice for this occasion, and you see it on the altar, the metal catching the light from the small windows, the workmanship speaking of another world, another standard of refinement brought north and east to this frontier of German settlement. St. Peter's Church served both spiritual needs and as a place for commercial oath-taking, and you understand as you watch the ceremony that these functions are not separate, that the oath before God and the witness of the community are the foundation of trade, the guarantee that binds distant parties across the silence of roads and seas. Tallow smoke hangs at chest height in the dwelling where you are assigned a sleeping place, the ceiling black with decades of accumulation, the light from a small lamp struggling to penetrate the haze. You are not alone. The room holds 6 men, their chests and their pallets arranged with the economy of space that necessity demands. The Peterhof maintained its own bathhouse, essential for health in the confined winter quarters, and you will learn to seek it out, to endure the birch whisks and the steam and the sharp medicinal note of juniper that cuts through the otherwise unrelenting smell of bodies and smoke, and the stored provisions that must last until spring. Merchants brought their own beer and bread supplies. Russian grain was considered inferior, and you see the sacks stacked in the warehouse, the barrels of beer from Lübeck, from Hamburg, from the familiar cities, the taste of home preserved and rationed across the months of separation. The clatter of the wooden water bucket chain from the Volkhov reaches you at dawn, the frozen fingers of the men who work it fumbling the rope as the weather turns, as autumn advances toward the ice. You have watched the winnowing, the autumn selection when the alderman determines who may stay, who must depart before the river freezes and the roads become impassable. The resident numbers fluctuated seasonally, perhaps 200 Germans in summer, 40 permitted to winter, and you have seen the anxiety in the faces of those who wait for his decision, the calculations of credit and obligation, and the simple preference for familiar company that influence his choice. German merchants were forbidden to own property outside the contour precincts, and so the winter population must be contained within the stockade, the wooden walls that surround the Peterhof, Curia Sancti Petri, the controlled gates now closed against the night and the cold. Winter contraction transforms the compound, and you are among the 40 who remain, the courtyard grown quiet, the warehouses locked, the routine of the shortened day establishing itself like a slow tide. The Peterhof maintained a bell and watch system for fire and security alerts, and you take your turn at this duty, walking the perimeter in darkness, listening to the sounds of the Russian city beyond the wall, the occasional voice, the bark of dogs, the vast silence of the frozen landscape that stretches away in every direction. The contour's archives, including the Schra registers, were kept in a locked chest, and you have seen the alderman open it with a heavy key, the documents that record the decisions and the disputes and the gradual accumulation of precedent that governs this community. Fines for contour infractions were paid into a common chest for the community's benefit, and you understand that this system, this mutual obligation, this shared resource, is what permits survival in a place where individual fortune would mean individual ruin. The bathhouse becomes your refuge in the winter months, the smell of birch whisks, steam, and the sharp medicinal note of juniper rising around you as you enter the small building near the church. The heat is intense, the steam thick enough to obscure the faces of the other men, and you submit to the ritual of the whisk, the slap of bundled branches against your skin, the shock of cold water that follows, the brief illusion of cleanliness in a world where water freezes in the bucket and the washing of garments is a luxury of summer. The relief of sweat, the temporary release from the smoke and the closeness of the dwelling, you feel this necessity in your own body, the bathhouse essential for health in the confined winter quarters. Sawdust and wood shavings still cover the floor of the carpentry shop, though the work has slowed, the coffins and furniture now made to order rather than in anticipation, the rhythm of labor adjusted to the diminished population. The man from Cologne still works at his bench, and you speak with him sometimes about the goldsmiths of his city, about the chalice he contributed to St. Peter's Church, about the distance that separates him from the world of his upbringing. The compound's physical layout changed over centuries as buildings burned and were rebuilt, and you can see the evidence of this in the irregular lines of the stockade. The replacement timbers paler against the older, darkened wood. The whole settlement a palimpsest of construction and destruction and renewed construction. The alderman calls a meeting in the hall, and you attend with the other winter residents, the 40 men from a dozen cities, now reduced by departure to a smaller, more intimate number. He speaks of the spring, of the ships that will come when the ice breaks, of the need to preserve order and discipline through the remaining months of confinement. He reports now on his most recent communication with the Posadnik and the Veche, the maintenance of good relations, the avoidance of incidents that might threaten the whole enterprise of German trade in Novgorod. You listen and you note the care with which he speaks, the weight of responsibility that he carries, the understanding that this settlement, this Peterhof, the Peterhof, Curia Sancti Petri, exists only by continuous negotiation, by the unceasing work of representation and accommodation. Fresh pine timber, newly cut for a warehouse roof, would bleed sap in the August heat, but now, in winter, the wood stands frozen, the sap stilled, the construction season far off and unimaginable. You walk through the compound in the brief daylight, your breath visible, the snow squeaking under your boots. The particular acoustic of a timber church draws you to St. Peter's, where a service is held on the Saint's Day, the intimate and resonant space filled with the voices of the small congregation. No stone to absorb the sound, everything returning, everything present. You think of the Cologne goldsmith, of the chalice on the altar, of the distance between this plain building and the cathedrals of the Rhineland. and yet the function is the same, the gathering of community, the witness of shared belief, the oath before God that underlies the oath before witnesses. Tallow smoke still hangs at chest height in the dwelling where you sleep, the ceiling black with decades of accumulation, the lamp burning low through the long evening. The men talk, sometimes of their cities, of the streets they will walk when they return, of the families they have left behind, the children growing in their absence, the wives who manage households sustained by the profits of this distant labor. You have watched the careful rationing of beer and bread, the measurement of the remaining stores, the calculation of weeks until the river opens. Russian grain was considered inferior, and yet you have seen the Russian markets, the abundance that surrounds this deliberate deprivation, the choice that maintains distinction even at cost. You have taken your turn at this duty too, your own fingers stiff and clumsy, the cold penetrating despite the layers of wool, the brief immersion in the river's edge a shock that lingers for hours. You have heard the bell ring once in the winter night, a false alarm, a chimney spark caught in time, the community roused, and then returned to sleep with the relief of practice unconfirmed by disaster. The contour's archives, including the Schra registers, await the spring, the locked chest in the meeting hall holding the record of another year of German presence in Novgorod. You have seen the aldermen make entries, the careful script, the Latin formulae, the Peterhof's Latin name, Curia Sancti Petri, appearing in 14th century sources and perhaps already in use, the solemnity of the designation matching the gravity of the institution. You have contributed once to the common chest, a small penalty for minor violation of the rules, the memory of it a private mark of your own learning curve in this regulated life. Spring comes slowly, the thaw a gradual yielding, the river breaking up in flows that grind against each other with a sound like distant thunder. The alderman prepares for the arrival of the ships, the summer expansion, the return of the 200 or more who will transform the quiet compound into the bustling center of trade. You have been selected to remain through another winter, or perhaps to depart with the first vessels, the decision not yet communicated, the uncertainty itself a familiar weight. The right bank of the Volkhov, the trade side, adjacent to the Novgorod market, will soon resume its summer character, the controlled gates open daily, the warehouses filling and emptying, the church of St. Peter witness to oaths and to worship in greater number. You stand at the landing stage as the first ship of the season approaches, its sail visible for a long time before the hull emerges from the mist that rises from the breaking ice. The Peterhof, the Peterhof, Curia Sancti Petri, one of 4 main Hanseatic contours, alongside those in London, Bruges and Bergen, resumes its larger life, and you are part of this renewal, this annual miracle of reconstitution. The term contour derives from French comptoir, meaning counting table or office, and you will return to that counting, that measurement of goods and credits, the small increments of profit that accumulate across a lifetime of voyages. Sawdust and wood shavings, fresh underfoot in the carpentry shop signal renewed activity, coffins and furniture made for the expanded population, the plane lifting its thin ribbon from the wood, the smell of resin and oil restored to the air. The particular acoustic of a timber church fills again with a larger congregation, the intimate and resonant space, no stone to absorb the sound, giving back the multiplied voices of the returned merchants. The Cologne goldsmith's chalice receives the wine of a fuller service, and you watch the ceremony with the knowledge of winter, of the 40 who held this place, of the continuity that persists beneath the seasonal variation. The alderman stands at the gate to greet the newcomers, the elderman elected by the resident merchants, his authority now exercised over a larger community, his responsibilities multiplied by the summer expansion. He explains the rules again, no private trade, no Russian women within, no weapons at meetings, the repetition itself a ritual, the foundation of order laid anew each year. Each arrival is a reenactment of that original establishment, the earliest documentary reference to a formal German court in Novgorod dating to the 1190s, each departure a temporary dissolution, the whole institution sustained by this rhythm of gathering and dispersal. You walk through the compound, the Peterhof, Curia Sancti Petri, the compound on the right bank of the Volkhov, the trade side, adjacent to the Novgorod market, and you feel the particular quality of a place that has been made, that has been maintained, that has been governed across generations by the continuous effort of merchants who came and who went and who left behind this structure. These rules, this community that you have entered and that will persist in some form beyond your own departure, your own return, your own eventual absence from the ships and the river and the wooden walls that contain the German presence in this Russian city. The bathhouse steam rises again with fuller use, the smell of birch whisks, steam, and the sharp medicinal note of juniper, now a mark of summer crowds as much as winter necessity. Now it serves also the restoration of travellers, the cleansing of the road, the reconstitution of the merchant as a fit participant in the regulated life of the contour. You enter it, and you submit to the whisk, and you emerge into the long evening of a northern summer, the light lingering, the compound still active, the warehouses receiving the first cargoes of the season. But now, in summer, the dwellings stand open to the air, the windows unshuttered, the smell of the courtyard, of the animals and the goods and the concentrated humanity, rising and dissipating in the moving atmosphere. You have lived through the contraction and the expansion, the 40 and the 200, the silence and the noise, and you understand something of how this place functions, how it persists, how it transforms the natural hostility of distance and difference into the regulated exchange that makes possible the small increments of profit, the slow accumulation, the lifetime of voyages that defines the merchant's existence. You watch the men who work it, the rhythm of their movement, the coordination that comes from repeated practice, and you see in this small operation something of the whole contour, the Peterhof, the Petershof, the continuous work of maintenance, of supply, of the unglamorous labor that sustains the possibility of trade. The contour's archives accumulate, the Schra registers in their locked chest, the record of another year, the precedent established for those who will come after. The Peterhof's Latin name, Curia Sancti Petri, appears in the documents you have seen, the 14th century sources that will survive, that will testify to this existence, this experiment in organized distance. You are part of this record, your name perhaps entered, your transactions noted, your presence one small element in the larger pattern that the alderman, the elderman elected by the resident merchants, is charged with maintaining, with representing, with continuing. Evening falls across the compound, the summer evening slow in coming, the light lingering in the northern sky. The wooden stockade with its controlled gates stands visible against the horizon, the boundary that defines this space, that separates the German merchant from the Russian city even as it permits the negotiation, the exchange, the profit that draws both parties together. You stand in the courtyard as the day's business concludes, the warehouses locked, the meeting hall empty, the church of St. Peter dark, except for the vigil light before the altar where the Cologne goldsmith's chalice rests in its stored security. Night completes its slow arrival, the sky darkening at last, the stars appearing in the clear northern air. You hear the first watch called, the bell ringing its single note, the signal that the community is guarded, that the night is met with organized attention. You make your way to your sleeping place, the dwelling that holds more men now, the summer population, the noise of breathing and movement, and the occasional voice that carries through the darkness. You fall asleep with the knowledge of this system, this mutual obligation, this shared fate that binds you to the men around you, to the alderman who governs, to the distant cities that sent you here, to the longer history of which you are now, however briefly, a part. The Easter light comes slowly through the high windows of the Peterhof chapel, and you are standing among the merchants who have gathered before dawn. The Schra chest has been brought from the unheated warehouse where it spends the year, and your breath is still visible in the cold air that clings to the oaken boards. The alderman walks ahead with a single beeswax candle, the flame steady in the motionless morning, and the parchment inside the chest rustles as the lid is lifted. The Schra was the written code of rules governing life within the Peterhof, and it has governed men here since before your grandfather's birth. The earliest surviving Schra dates to 1265, though the code existed in earlier form, and the document you see unrolled bears the marks of 4 centuries of annotations and amendments visible in the margins. Some hands wrote firmly in black ink, others faded to brown, others barely legible where dampness reached the edges in some forgotten season. The Schra regulated everything from trading practices to religious observance to personal conduct, and this morning you will hear its full extent spoken aloud. Around you, the merchants shift their weight on the stone floor, their woolen cloaks brushing against each other with a soft, continuous sound. You are standing near a young Bremen merchant who stifles resentment as he swears the oath he finds humiliating, his jaw tight beneath his beard, his eyes fixed on some point above the alderman's shoulder. All merchants were required to swear an oath upon entry to obey the Schra and the alderman, and this youth has arrived only since the autumn ships departed. His hands, you notice, are clenched behind his back as the words are spoken, the knuckles pale against the dark cloth of his sleeves. The Schra was written in Low German, the lingua franca of the Hanseatic merchant class, and the alderman's voice moves through its provisions with the rhythm of long practice. The chapel's stone walls return each phrase with a slight delay, so that you hear every word twice, the immediate sound and its softer echo. Religious observance was mandatory. Attendance at Mass, fasting in Lent, confession before departure, and the Schra specifies precise penalties: a shilling for missing Mass, a mark for drawing a weapon. The young Bremen merchant's lips move silently with the final phrases, mouthing obedience he does not yet feel. The candlelight catches the grease and dust of generations on the parchment surface, and you watch the alderman's finger trace the lines of script. The Schra was read aloud annually, usually at Easter, and all present affirmed it, a tradition that binds the living to the dead who once stood where you stand now. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of attention, their morning fatigue, their residual dreams of home, and returning them to the discipline of the yard. The cold air moves across your face from the chapel door, which stands open to admit the grey light of the courtyard beyond. No merchant could leave the compound without permission during trading hours, and already the day is arranging itself into the permitted and the forbidden, the scheduled and the deferred. The Schra's rigidity was frequently complained of, but its uniformity was the Hanse's strength, and you feel this strength now as a pressure against your own impulses, your own preference for solitude, your own habit of private decision. The alderman reaches the passage concerning the common fund, and his voice takes on a particular weight, a particular silence settling across the assembled men, even the dogs stilling in some distant corner. You're walking back through the courtyard as the sun clears the chapel roof, and the stone beneath your boots carries the damp of melted frost. The Schra chest will be returned to its warehouse, and the day will proceed according to the provisions you have heard. Private trade outside the common fund was forbidden. All transactions were pooled and divided, and this prohibition sits in your mind with the weight of a physical object, a stone in the pocket of your awareness. The young Bremen merchant walks ahead of you, his shoulders still rigid with the effort of his suppressed feeling, and you wonder how long his resistance will last, how many seasons before the Schra becomes not constraint but habit, not imposition but structure. The yard opens around you, the buildings of the Peterhof arranged with the regularity that the code demands, the warehouse doors already unsealed for the day's business. You remember your own first Easter here, your own resentment, your own slow accommodation to a life measured by rules you had no part in making. The summer light lies flat across the yard by mid-morning, and you are standing near the warehouse where furs are sorted and graded. A midsummer crisis has arisen. A Lübecker caught selling wax on his own account is fined and shamed, and the word has passed through the compound with the speed that news travels in confined spaces. The man stands before the alderman's door, his goods confiscated, his name to be entered in the record of infractions. The penalty for this violation has long been established. You watch from a distance as the fine is pronounced, as the man turns away with the stiff movements of one who has rehearsed this departure, who has imagined it, and now must perform it. Gambling, drinking to excess, and consorting with Russian women were prohibited under penalty of fine. But the sin of private trade strikes deeper, strikes at the foundation of the common enterprise. The common fund covered expenses for church, defense, gifts to Novgorod officials, and relief of distressed merchants, and each private transaction diminishes this capacity, steals from the collective body that sustains all who swear the oath. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of judgment, of sympathy withheld or extended, of calculation concerning their own past infractions and future temptations. The particular silence that settled when the alderman pronounced the fine has passed now into ordinary noise, into the resumed work of the yard, but something remains in the air, a tension that the summer heat does not dissipate. The alderman held absolute authority during the sailing season. Disputes were settled by majority vote in winter, and this Lübecker will have no recourse until the ships have departed and the ice formed on the river. You are standing at the edge of the yard where the shadow of the warehouse falls across the dust, and the taste of the common beer, thin and sour, brewed from the last good grain, lingers from your midday meal, a reminder of the equality that the Schra imposes, the same sustenance for all who live within these walls. You see this uniformity now as a kind of armor, a protection against the chaos of individual appetite. The Lübecker passes near where you stand, and his face is closed, unreadable, the face of a man who is determined to reveal nothing. Violations of the Schra could result in expulsion from the contour and loss of trading rights, and he has been spared this extremity, this death of his mercantile identity. For 5 centuries, men have stood where he stands now, have felt this same shame, this same calculation of cost and survival. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of resumed work, of deliberate normalcy, of the pretense that the crisis has already passed into memory. The pine, resin sealing a disciplinary notice to the church door, glistens in the sunlight, fresh and amber-colored, and you know that the notice will remain until the fine is paid, until the community has been satisfied. The presence of the Schra is everywhere in this moment, in the lowered voices, in the averted eyes, in the careful distance that the other merchants maintain from the condemned man. You are walking through the warehouse where the furs hang in rows, and the autumn dispute has begun to gather its participants. 2 factions divide over the price of furs. The alderman imposes silence until vote, and the atmosphere in the long room carries the quality of held breath, of words swallowed back, of arguments compressed into the narrow space of internal monologue. The Schra reaches now into this disagreement, shaping the form that resolution may take. No merchant could pledge the common credit without aldermanic authorization, and this prohibition has become relevant, has been invoked by one faction against the other, the accusation of unauthorized commitment hanging in the air like the dust motes that drift through the light from the high windows. You are standing near the rear wall, your hand touching the pelt of a sable, and the texture is dense, luxurious, a concentration of value that makes the dispute comprehensible, the passion behind it almost sympathetic. The alderman stands at the center of the space, and the particular silence descends again as he declares the terms of deferral, even the dogs stilling somewhere beyond the walls. This matter will wait, will be held in suspension through the months of remaining activity, will be addressed only when the ships are gone and the men confined to the compound by ice and darkness. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of frustration, of arguments half-formed that must now be dismantled and stored, of the particular fatigue that comes from suppressed speech. The cold of the unheated warehouse where the Schra chest is stored seems to penetrate even here, even in this autumn moment before the true cold has arrived, as if the principle of deferral itself carried a chill. You remember your own voice among the others at Easter, the commitment to processes that delay, that resist the impulse of immediate resolution. You are walking back through the yard as the light declines, and the colors of the buildings have shifted from the warm tones of afternoon to the cooler register of evening. You hear fragments of low German from the men you pass, the cadences of complaint and consolation, of plans deferred and strategies revised. The common fund is the silent participant in every dispute, the beneficiary of every resolution that preserves the collective against the individual. The young Bremen merchant you noticed at Easter stands in a doorway, and his face has changed, has softened into the expression of one who has begun to accept, to internalize the structure he once resented. The repetition of the oath across years and across men creates a continuity that gradually becomes indistinguishable from identity. The first snow comes with a particular quality of silence, and you are standing in the yard as it begins, the flakes large and sparse, descending through the still air with a deliberation that seems almost ceremonial. Winter discipline has begun. The common meal, the same stew, the same beer, the same complaints, and you are walking toward the hall where the merchants gather. The taste of the common beer is already present in your anticipation, a sensation that has become inseparable from the season, from the contraction of life into the heated spaces of the compound. The Schra's winter provisions are different, permitting more individual arrangements in summer, but drawing all together now into the common room, the common table, the common fate. Meals were taken in common during winter. Summer permitted more individual arrangements, and this reversal of the ordinary preference for privacy is itself a discipline, a training in the subordination of personal desire to collective necessity. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of the day's small events, of warehouse work completed, of letters received or awaited, of the slow adjustment to a world shrunk to the dimensions of the Peterhof. A related quiet falls when certain topics are raised, when the Schra itself becomes subject of conversation. You hear this paradox articulated in the voices around you, the complaint and the defense intertwined, the recognition that the system sustains even those who chafe against it. The stew arrives in its common pot, and the steam rises with the smell of barley and the root vegetables that store through the winter, the same nourishment for all who extend their bowls. In winter, the prohibition against leaving the compound extends to all hours, the gate secured, the world outside becoming gradually abstract, a memory, a subject for speculation rather than a place of actual possibility. You are sitting at the long table, and the man beside you speaks of his city, of Bremen, of the cathedral there and the markets along the river, his voice low and continuous, a form of sustenance parallel to the food. You feel the Schra's presence in this conversation, in the boundaries that are not crossed, in the subjects that are not raised, in the mutual accommodation that makes communal life possible. The longevity of this code is itself a comfort in the winter darkness, a proof that others have endured this confinement, this compression, this waiting. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of memory, of the cities that sent them here, the longer history of which you are now, however briefly, a part, and the sound of their voices blends with the sound of the fire, the crack of settling wood, the hiss of sap escaping. The alderman sits at the head of the table, and his presence is a reminder of the hierarchy that persists even in this apparent equality, the authority that will be fully restored when the sailing season returns. The stew finishes, and the beer continues, and the complaints continue, and you find yourself listening with a detachment that the darkness outside seems to encourage. Amendments required unanimous consent during the sailing season, 2/3 in winter, and this provision has been invoked, you know, in past winters, has allowed the modification of rules that no longer served, has preserved the Schra's relevance against the rigidity that might otherwise have destroyed it. The affirmation at Easter is not merely ceremonial, not merely repetition, but a living commitment that must be renewed, must be chosen again in each generation. The young Bremen merchant sits across from you now, and his face in the firelight shows the marks of adaptation, of the slow process by which the self is reshaped to fit the container it inhabits. The prohibition against private trade, once external, has begun to operate within him, has become a principle of his own judgment, his own restraint. You are walking back to your sleeping quarters through the frozen yard, and the snow has accumulated enough to soften the sound of your boots, to transform the compound into a space of unusual quiet. A death in the compound has occurred, and the Schra specifies the funeral rite. The common fund pays, and you are thinking of this provision as you walk, of the completeness with which the code anticipates the events of a life, from the oath of entry to the rite of departure. The man who has died was old, was present at your own first Easter here, was among those who affirmed the Schra when you first heard it read, and his absence at the next Easter will be a palpable alteration, a silence where a voice once joined the chorus. The cold air moves across your face with a severity that the earlier snow did not possess, and the cold of the unheated warehouse where the Schra chest is stored seems to have spread outward, to have claimed the entire compound for its own. The Schra reaches now into death, into the proper disposition of the body, the proper prayers, the proper notification of the distant city that once sent this man forth. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of grief, of the particular grief that comes in confined spaces where the dead are not abstractions, but daily presences now removed. The particular silence that attends the alderman's formal pronouncements will be required at the funeral, and you prepare yourself for this discipline of proper response. The common fund will now cover the coffin, the candles, the masses for the soul, the transmission of news to the family. You are standing at the door of the chapel, which has been prepared, and the rustle of parchment seems almost audible, as if the document itself were present, were reading along with the priest. The provisions for religious observance, applied to the living, now frame the commemoration of the dead. The beeswax candles at the oath-taking, the only time such luxury is permitted the individual, are not present here. The funeral candles are of tallow, of the common supply, and their light is yellower, less steady, more prone to gutter in the draughts that enter through the chapel's imperfect construction. Yet this equality in death, this commonality of the final rite, carries its own dignity, its own statement of the principle that the Schra enforces throughout life. You are standing among the merchants who have gathered, and the alderman reads from the Schra the provisions that apply, his voice moving through the low German phrases with the same rhythm that you heard at Easter, the same cadence of long-established usage. Now it is read for this different purpose, this application to a particular case, this guidance of the community through one of the events that the code has always known would come. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of mortality, of the recognition that the history of which they are part extends beyond their own participation, will continue when their own names have passed into the silence that now surrounds this dead man's name. You are walking back through the darkness after the service, and the snow has begun again, finer now, more persistent, a weather that seems to conspire with the season's confinement. You feel the Schra's strength now as a kind of warmth, a protection against the cold that is physical and also metaphysical, the cold of uncertainty, of the unstructured, of the life without the oath and its consequences. The young Bremen merchant walks beside you, and his voice, when he speaks, carries the timbre of one who has been affected by the ceremony, who has recognized in the death of another the shape of his own eventual ending, the common fate that the Schra acknowledges and frames. The warehouse doors are closed against the night, and the yard is empty except for the falling snow and the slow movement of men returning to their quarters. The alderman's absolute authority, suspended now in favor of a more collective mode, will return with the ships, with the thaw, with the resumption of the commercial year. You are standing at the door of your own building, looking back across the space you have traversed, and the Peterhof appears transformed by the snow, its edges softened, its severity muted, almost gentle in the darkness. The Schra governs now even this moment of pause, this looking back, this brief exemption from the forward movement of sleep and tomorrow's work. The taste of the common beer lingers still, or perhaps returns as a memory, a sensory anchor that orients you in this darkness, that connects this moment to all the other moments of winter communion. You hear fragments of low German from the buildings around you, the last conversations before sleep, the good nights and the prayers, the small sounds of a community preparing for rest. A related quiet descends as the last voices cease, as the compound settles into the stillness of deep night, of the hours before dawn when even the most restless sleep most deeply. You are lying in your place, and the darkness is complete, and the cold of the unheated warehouse where the Schra chest is stored seems to have followed you here, to have become the temperature of your own breath, your own skin, your own slow descent towards sleep. The comprehensiveness of the Schra, which once seemed oppressive, now presents itself as a kind of care, a maternal attention that anticipates need, that structures possibility, that prevents the exhaustion of infinite choice. The memory of the Lübecker's shame, of the fine and the notice and the slow return to accepted standing, moves through your mind and passes, replaced by the image of the Easter light, the unrolling of the parchment, the affirmation of continuity. The common fund is the invisible presence in your own life, the guarantee that has brought you here, that sustains you, that will provide for your own distress, should it come, for your own funeral, should that be necessary, for the continuation of the community that precedes and will outlast your individual participation. The rustle of parchment seems almost audible in the darkness, as if the document were being read in some other part of the compound, as if its words continued their circulation even in sleep. The morning light enters the warehouse through windows set high in the northern wall, and you are standing near the center of the stone floor as the first bales emerge from the cellars below. The blue-gray illumination falls in pale rectangles across the dust that rises with each movement, and you watch as men in heavy felt coats carry the compressed bundles up the narrow stairs. The mustiness of old fur bales greets you immediately, the dried blood and salt of the curing process mingling with the cold air that clings to the hides. These are the winter's accumulation from the Perm region and beyond the Ural Mountains, and they have waited through the frozen months for this day of inspection. Novgorod's primary exports to the west were furs, wax, honey and flax, and now the first of these categories is about to undergo its careful assessment. You feel the dense, almost oily richness of high-grade sable as a nearby bundle is opened, the individual hairs iridescent even in the subdued light. Around you, the merchants are preparing their stations, and the Gosti, Novgorod's merchants who acted as intermediaries between the forest hunters and the foreign buyers, move between the arriving goods with the confidence of men who have handled such transactions for decades. A ghost from the north arrives with tales of 1,000 miles travelled, sable in his pack, and his boots leave meltwater on the stone where frost still clings to the leather. The hunting season for valuable furs extended through the winter, when pelts were prime, and this man has been travelling since the first thaw made the forest roads usable. You observe the particular blue-grey light of a Novgorod warehouse, high windows, dust in sunbeams, as it catches the breath that escapes his lips in the unheated space. The grading begins with the unpacking of the first tier of bales, and you are positioned where you can see the careful unfolding of each hide. The northern fur trade extended into the Perm region and beyond the Ural Mountains, and these pelts have passed through many hands before reaching this warehouse near the river. Sable, the most prized fur, was worth its weight in silver in Western European markets, and the men who open the bales handle certain bundles with visible anticipation. The hides stiff with frost, brought directly from the cold store, creak as they bend under the grader's manipulation. You notice the sharp metallic scent of the testing knife, passed from hand to hand, as one of the senior merchants accepts the blade to verify the quality of a disputed pelt. The dense, almost oily richness of high-grade sable fills the air when a particularly fine specimen is displayed, the individual hairs iridescent with that peculiar darkness that commands the highest prices. A dispute over grade arises before the morning has advanced far, and you are standing near enough to hear the quiet argument. Is this fox pale or cross? The price difference is 20%, and the two men examining the pelt hold it toward the light from the high windows with the solemnity of priests consulting a sacred text. The particular blue-grey light of a Novgorod warehouse, high windows, dust in sunbeams, falls across the fur in question, and you observe the subtle variation in colour that has caused this disagreement. The mustiness of old fur bales, the dried blood and salt of the curing process, seems to intensify in the corner where this examination occurs, as if the material itself were offering testimony. The fur trade was controlled through a system of tribute and trading posts, the pogosts, and this pelt has already passed through such a station where initial assessments were made. The alderman approaches the disputed bundle with the measured pace of a man whose authority has been established through decades of such decisions, and you watch as he produces his own testing implements. He tests wax cakes for purity in the adjoining chamber, scraping, burning, sniffing for tallow adulteration, though his current task is the arbitration of this fur grade. The sharp metallic scent of the testing knife, passed from hand to hand, accompanies his examination as he borrows the blade to make his own incision of the hide. You observe how the dense, almost oily richness of high-grade sable serves as his mental reference point, the individual hairs iridescent in his memory even when he examines lesser pelts. The most valuable furs, sable, black fox, ermine, were reserved for princely and ecclesiastical buyers, and his judgment of this common fox will determine whether it enters that elevated category or remains in the commercial grade. The morning advances toward noon with the continued unpacking of the northern bales, and you move through the space as the crowd shifts between stations. The ghost from the north, his tales of 1,000 miles travelled still resonating, is noted by several of the German merchants who wait with the patience of men accustomed to distant communications. The Hanseatic contour did not deal directly with hunters. All trade passed through Novgorod middlemen, and these foreigners observe the proceedings with the restraint of their contractual position. You feel the cold air move across your face as a door opens to admit another bearer, and the mustiness of old fur bales, the dried blood and salt of the curing process, receives this new contribution to its accumulated atmosphere. The wax inspection begins in the adjoining chamber, and you are standing near the threshold as the alderman turns his attention to this second category of goods. The Novgorod hinterland produced vast quantities of beeswax for candle making and sealing, and the cakes displayed upon the long table represent the collected tribute of numerous settlements. Wax was collected as tribute from monasteries and peasant beekeepers across the Republic, and the variety of sources is visible in the slight variations of color and density before you. The alderman tests wax cakes for purity, scraping, burning, sniffing for tallow adulteration, and his first sample yields the clean white curl, the immediate sweet smell that indicates honest preparation. You observe the contrast when a second cake produces the greasy yellow of adulteration, and the merchant responsible for its presentation accepts this finding with the stoicism of a man who has heard such judgments before. The dense, almost oily richness of high-grade sable lingers in your awareness from the earlier room, the individual hairs iridescent in memory, while the immediate sweetness of pure wax competes for your attention. The Gosti circulate with the quiet purpose of men who understand that their mediation sustains this entire commercial architecture. Afternoon brings the consolidation of the morning's judgments, and you are standing near the western wall as the graded pelts are pressed into their final bales. Furs were pressed into bales, graded by quality, and marked with the contour seal, and the heavy compression requires the coordinated effort of several workers. The Gost from the north adds his final bundles to the accumulated mass, and you watch as the dense, almost oily richness of high-grade sable is once more displayed, the individual hairs iridescent in the afternoon light that now enters at a lower angle through the high windows. The loading begins as the light outside assumes the long shadows of evening, and you are standing at the harbour as the first bales are carried toward the waiting cog. Bales pressed into the cog's hold, the last space filled with personal wax purchases, proceed with the methodical urgency of men who understand tidal schedules and contractual deadlines. Wax was cast into standardized cakes for ease of transport and accounting, and the regular packages stack with a geometric precision that the irregular fur bales cannot achieve. The Gosti supervise this transfer with the attentiveness of men whose credit depends upon accurate delivery. You observe how the mustiness of old fur bales, the dried blood and salt of the curing process, merges with the river's own odor of weed and sediment as the cargo crosses between these two domains. The forest roads were usable only in winter, when frozen. Summer travel was by river, and this vessel represents the continuation of that seasonal logic into the mercantile sphere. The dense, almost oily richness of high-grade sable, the individual hairs iridescent, seems to cling to your own garments from the warehouse immersion. The last spaces in the hold receive the personal wax purchases of individual merchants, and you are standing near the vessel's rail as these smaller packages are tucked around the larger bales. You notice the clean white curl, the immediate sweet smell of his verified cakes as they are wrapped in linen for his individual account. The greasy yellow of adulteration has been rejected for these purposes, though you understand that lesser wax still finds markets in less discriminating contexts. The value of a single Novgorod trading voyage could equal a year's income for a Lubeck patrician, and you consider this equivalence as the final lashings are secured across the loaded cargo. Prices were set at the opening of the trading season, after inspection of the winter's accumulation, and the morning's judgments have now been translated into the numerical language of contracts. The fur trade's profitability declined in the 15th century due to overhunting and competition, but this current season still maintains the prosperity of earlier patterns. You feel the cold air move across your face with the vessel's slight motion against the dock, and the sharp metallic scent of the testing knife, passed from hand to hand, seems to reach you from the warehouse you have left. The ship prepares for departure with the slow deliberation of a vessel dependent upon wind and current, and you remain at the harbour as the crew completes their preparations. The Gosti have already withdrawn to count their receipts and prepare for the next season's anticipations. You imagine the Gost from the north returning to the forest hinterland that produced these goods, his path retracing those distances when the next winter makes the forest roads usable. The evening settles over the river with the gradual dimming that accompanies these northern latitudes, and you are walking back through streets that have emptied of their commercial urgency. Your path carries you past the contour's closed doors, and you observe the quiet that has descended upon this quarter now that the season's main business has concluded. Import goods included Flemish and English cloth, Rhenish wine, metal goods, and salt, and you recall that the salt trade was critical. Novgorod's own production insufficient, German salt from Lüneburg competed with Portuguese. These incoming commodities have already been distributed through their own channels, and the balance of exchange has been maintained for another season. The cold air moves across your face with the faint iodine suggestion of the salt you have considered. The monastery bells mark the progression of evening prayer, and you are standing in an open square as their sound spreads across the darkening city. You imagine the clean white curl, the immediate sweet smell of his private wax serving to illuminate such an evening, versus the greasy yellow of adulteration that would betray a careless supplier. Your thoughts drift with the evening toward the distant sources of the day's commerce, and you consider the hunter's widow at a distant pogost who receives her fraction, never knowing the final price in Bruges. The night advances with the slow rotation of stars that these northern skies display, and you are standing at the edge of the city where the forest begins its own darkness. You imagine the Gost from the north returning through these same tracks when the next freeze permits. The river reflects what light remains in the sky, and you are walking along its bank as the cog you observed earlier has now disappeared into the downstream darkness. The city's edge yields to the forest's beginning, and you are standing where the cultivated fields give way to the trees that have supplied this trade for centuries. The Gosti have already begun to diversify their interests toward other commodities and other routes. Your return path carries you through quarters where the beekeepers have long since completed their seasonal work, and you pass the stored hives that will resume their production with the next flowering. The deeper night brings a colder quality to the air, and you are standing in the courtyard of a modest establishment where a single light still burns in an upper window. A hunter's widow at a distant pogost receives her fraction, never knowing the final price in Bruges, and you imagine some analogous figure within this urban context, waiting for news of a vessel's arrival or a merchant's return. The cold air moves across your face with the impartiality of weather that serves all interests equally, and the particular blue-grey light of a Novgorod warehouse, high windows, dust in sunbeams, seems impossibly distant from this nocturnal domesticity. The stars have shifted their positions when you next pause, and you are standing at a junction where several paths diverge toward the river, the forest, and the continuing streets of the settled quarter. Russian flax was considered superior for linen production. German merchants exported it in quantity, and the fields that produced this fiber extend in their own patterns of cultivation beyond the immediate horizon. The approaching dawn begins as a barely perceptible lightening in the eastern sky, and you are standing where the river's curve allows a view of the distant horizon. The Gosti will resume their mediations with the morning's full activity. The first sounds of morning activity reach you from the direction of the harbor, and you are standing as the mist rises from the water with the warming of the day. The cold air moves across your face with the freshness of a new day that carries both continuity and the possibility of change. Your final position is upon a slight elevation where the city's arrangement becomes visible in its larger pattern, and you are standing as the full dawn establishes itself across the river and its surrounding territories. The Gosti, Novgorod's merchants who acted as intermediaries between the forest hunters and the foreign buyers, will maintain their mediations while any margin of profit remains. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, and the last cog of October is preparing its final departure against a sky the colour of pale steel. Around you, the merchants who will remain through winter are counting the faces of those who leave, noting each name with the quiet understanding that these same faces will not be seen again for 7 months at minimum. The sailing season to Novgorod was constrained by ice from November to April, a fact that governed every calculation of the mercantile year and every farewell exchanged upon these wooden quays. German merchants who failed to depart by late October risked being trapped for winter, and the penalties of such miscalculation extended far beyond mere inconvenience into the realm of survival itself. You watch the cog sail fill with the last favourable wind, its hull heavy with the final westbound cargo of furs and wax and honey, the products of a year's careful accumulation. The water of the Gulf of Finland still moves freely today, but the surface carries a different quality, a viscosity, and a chill that speaks of the transformation already beginning in the deeper currents. The merchants upon the deck do not wave extravagantly. The moment holds too much finality for such gestures, and the discipline of their calling restrains even the natural impulses of leave-taking. By mid-November, the transformation is complete. You are standing upon the frozen bank of the Volkhov, and the river's surface has become a highway of ice that extends in either direction beyond the limits of clear sight. The absolute silence of 30 below, sound carried strangely across the frozen river, creates an acoustic world unlike any other season of the year. A dog's bark 3 versts distant arrives with the clarity of a nearby conversation, while a shout from the opposite bank seems to originate from somewhere inside your own skull. The pressure ridges form in the night with sounds like distant thunder or the groaning of some immense creature turning in its sleep, and you lie in your narrow chamber listening to this geological conversation, conducted in tones too low for full comprehension. The Gulf of Finland typically froze by December, the Never River shortly after, and the progressive sealing of these waterways transforms the colony from a node of international exchange into an isolated settlement dependent upon its own resources and its own company. The particular quality of light through ice-glazed windows, prismatic, cold, defines the interior experience of December days within the Peterhof compound. You are seated in the communal hall at noon, and the Mass is being celebrated by candlelight, though the hour is technically midday. For the sun at this latitude offers little more than a brief appearance above the southern horizon before its retreat. Wintering permissions were strictly limited. Only essential personnel remained at the Peterhof, and the alderman's accounting of provisions conducted on the shortest day determines whether the remaining stores will sustain this reduced company through the months still to come. The trapped merchants lived in near-monastic conditions, confined, communal, disciplined, and the architecture of their daily existence now reflects this contraction of possibility. You observe the faces around you in the candlelight, noting the gradual adaptation to this diminished sphere, the acceptance of a world bounded by these walls and these familiar countenances. The winter diet was preserved. Dried fish, pickled meat, peas, barley, beer, no fresh vegetables, and the body learns to crave what it cannot have with a persistence that becomes, itself, a form of meditation. Scurvy was a known risk. Spruce beer and pickled cabbage provided some vitamin C, and the cook's preparation of these prophylactic measures follows procedures established through decades of painful experience. You taste the spruce beer with its resinous sharpness, understanding it as medicine as much as refreshment, and you note the careful rotation of the pickled cabbage barrels to ensure that none are exhausted before their appointed time. The compound maintained ice houses for summer storage. Winter provided natural refrigeration, and the symmetry of this arrangement offers a certain satisfaction to minds trained in the balancing of accounts and the optimization of resources. Fire was the greatest danger in the wooden city. The Peterhof maintained strict watch schedules, and the night hours are divided into watches that pass with deliberate slowness. You are walking the perimeter in the hour before false dawn, and your footsteps upon the packed snow create a rhythm that marks time in the absence of other measurement. The woodpile shrinks with visible speed as February deepens, and the cold achieves an intensity that seems almost personal in its attention, seeking out every gap in clothing, every moment of inattention. The decision to burn a disused shed comes in the deepest cold, a calculated sacrifice that extends the remaining fuel through the final weeks of necessity. The long winter nights were occupied with maintenance, account-keeping, religious observance, and limited social activity, and you observe how the merchants fill these hours with a purposefulness that refuses the despair of mere waiting. The psychological strain of winter confinement was acknowledged. The Schra permitted some relaxation of rules, and certain evenings see the formal structures of the compound loosen into something approaching conviviality. You are present at such a gathering, and the sound of a lute played by a merchant from Lübeck fills the hall with melodies that carry memory westward to cities presently inaccessible. The relaxation is temporary and bounded, yet it serves its purpose of sustaining morale through the longest nights, when the mind turns naturally toward speculation about conditions elsewhere, about markets and prices, and the lives of those who move freely in warmer latitudes. Weather patterns in the 14th century may have worsened during the early phase of the Little Ice Age, and the merchants who established these wintering protocols were responding to conditions more severe than those their predecessors had known. The groan and thunder of river ice breaking, a sound like artillery felt in the chest, arrives in April with a violence that contradicts the gentleness of its promise. You are standing upon the bank as the first thaw releases the Volkhov from its imprisonment, and the river groans with a voice that seems to express both pain and relief in equal measure. Spring breakup brought floods. The Volkhov could rise dramatically, carrying ice damage, and the first false hope of liberation is often followed by another freeze that restores the silence and the waiting with a cruelty that tests even the most disciplined temperament. You observe the waters rise, the ice cakes spinning past with their cargo of branches and debris, and you understand that the river's freedom is not yet your own. The first cogs typically arrived in May, bearing news, letters, and supplies from the west, and the interval between thaw and arrival remains a period of suspended anticipation, of preparation without certainty. The smell of the ice house, clean, metallic, the stored apples' last sweetness, greets you as the compound transitions from winter conservation to summer preparation. You are examining the remaining stores, noting the apples that have preserved their condition through the natural refrigeration of the season, understanding that these last fruits will soon give way to the first fresh provisions of the new sailing season. The annual rhythm created a particular merchant type, patient, calculating, capable of deferred gratification, and you observe these qualities in the methodical manner with which the merchants prepare for the arrival that will transform their circumstances. The sailing season grew slightly more unpredictable in the 15th century, affecting trade calculations, and the alderman's ledgers now incorporate margins of uncertainty that would have seemed excessive to earlier generations. Summer days were long. At the solstice, twilight extended past midnight at Novgorod's latitude, the sky never fully dark, sleep difficult, energy oddly sustained, a season of paradoxical exhaustion. You are walking the harbor at an hour that would be deepest night in other latitudes, and the light holds the quality of perpetual dusk, neither fully day nor properly night. This endless summer twilight becomes itself a form of temporal confusion, as though the sun's reluctance to set has infected human rhythms with a similar resistance to proper rest. The compound's activity continues far into these luminous nights, the merchants taking advantage of the extended visibility to conduct business that winter's darkness had constrained. The taste of the first fresh greens in June, after 8 months of preserved food, arrives with an intensity that the body has nearly forgotten how to process. You are seated at the first proper meal of the new season, and the vegetables from the surrounding countryside taste of earth and growth, and the particular quality of light that has produced them. The psychological release of this dietary transformation matches the physical relief, and you observe how the merchant's demeanor alters with their nutrition, how the confined tensions of winter begin to dissolve into something more expansive and more capable of risk. Spring brought not only liberation, but anxiety. Had prices changed? Had competitors arrived first? The first letters from the West, borne by the May cogs, are received with eagerness that conceals its own fear, for the information they contain will determine whether the waiting has been justified by profit or merely endured for survival. Autumn storms on the Baltic could delay departure. Merchants gambled on the last favorable wind, and the final weeks of the sailing season reproduce in miniature the uncertainties that govern the larger annual cycle. The same scene that opened this chapter repeats with the variation that time always introduces, the same faces absent or present according to the particular decisions of this particular year. The mast of a cog visible downstream, the compound erupting in controlled activity, belongs properly to May rather than October, yet it forms the counter-rhythm to the departure that seals each winter's beginning. You are standing upon the slight elevation, where the city's arrangement becomes visible in its larger pattern, and you are watching as the full dawn establishes itself across the river and its surrounding territories. The first arrival transforms the compound from a place of conservation to a place of exchange, and the merchants who have endured the winter confinement emerge with the patience and calculation that endurance has cultivated. The annual rhythm persists, the sailing season to Novgorod constrained by ice from November to April, the German merchants departing by late October or accepting the near-monastic conditions that follow, the first cogs arriving in May with their cargo of news and renewal. You are present at this perpetual cycle, neither fully participant nor merely observer, standing at the harbor as the light changes and the ice forms or breaks according to its own calendar. The particular qualities of each season mark the passage of time with a sensory specificity that written records cannot fully capture. The Peterhof compound maintains its watch schedules and its ice houses, its strict permissions and its Schra-sanctioned relaxations, its preserved diet and its prophylactic spruce beer, through centuries of this annual repetition. The merchants who shaped this system and were shaped by it in return have left their traces in ledgers and regulations, in the physical fabric of the compound, and in the psychological type that the annual rhythm produced. Patient, calculating, capable of deferred gratification, they understood that profit and survival alike depended upon the acceptance of natural limitation rather than its defiance. You are standing as the light changes, as the river freezes or flows, as the cogs depart or arrive, and the cold air moves across your face with the freshness of a new day that carries both continuity and the possibility of change. The winter confinement that defined their existence, the spring liberation that both released and tested them, the summer activity that exhausted and sustained them, the autumn gamble that concluded each cycle, all these persist in the pattern that you observe, the pattern that governed the winters of ice and summers of sailing across the centuries of the Novgorod colony's existence. The final freeze of this particular year is approaching, or perhaps it has already begun, the pressure ridges forming in the night with sounds that carry strangely across the frozen river. You are standing at the harbor, and the last faces are being counted, the last provisions are counted, the last candles lit for the mass that will mark the shortest day. The alderman's voice carries through the prismatic cold of the ice-glazed windows, establishing the discipline that will govern the months of confinement to come. The woodpile awaits its gradual diminishment. The disused shed stands ready for its possible sacrifice. The watch schedules are posted for the fire prevention that winter's dryness and darkness demand. The psychological strain is acknowledged. The Schra permits its limited relaxation. The near-monastic conditions are accepted with the patience that calculation and deferred gratification have cultivated. Spring will come, as it always comes, with the groan and thunder of river ice breaking, and the floods that carry their own damage and their own promise. The first false hope will be followed by the possible second freeze. The interval of waiting will extend beyond what optimism had projected, and then the mast of a cog will be visible downstream, and the compound will erupt in the controlled activity that liberation demands. The letters will bring their mixed intelligence of prices and competitors. The fresh greens will taste of the particular quality of light that produced them. The endless twilight will disturb sleep and sustain energy through the luminous nights of commerce. Autumn storms will threaten and perhaps delay. The last favorable wind will be gambled upon and perhaps lost, and the cycle will complete itself as you stand at the harbor at dawn, the cold air moving across your face with the freshness of a new day that carries both continuity and the possibility of change. The pattern persists. The ice forms and breaks upon the Volkhov, the Gulf of Finland, the Never River. The merchants depart or remain, endure or prosper, according to their preparation and their fortune and the particular severity of each season's conditions. The Peterhof compound maintains its structures of survival through the centuries of the Little Ice Age's gradual intensification, through the increasing unpredictability of the 15th century's sailing season, through the profitability decline, and the persistence nevertheless of this rhythm that has shaped so many lives. You are standing at the threshold of Yaroslav's court as the morning bell begins its summons, and the deep, cracked note rolls across the open space where the Veche will gather. The sky above is pale with winter, a thin milk-colored light that offers no warmth to the assembly benches arranged in rough semicircles upon the earth. Around you, the merchants of the Hanseatic League are straightening their cloaks and adjusting their fur collars, preparing to enter a political theater they have learned to read with anxious precision. The echoing space of Yaroslav's court, open to the sky, permits voices to carry to the back benches where lesser boyars and their retainers strain to catch each word of dispute. You watch as the interpreters take their positions between the raised seat and the waiting Germans, knowing that the slight delay between speech and translation will create moments when the room seems to breathe in between, when meaning hangs suspended and any interpretation becomes possible. The Veche was the popular assembly governing Novgorod from at least the 12th century, and its ancient authority fills this enclosure with a weight that no foreigner can fully comprehend, though every German merchant who wishes to trade must learn its rhythms and its dangers. The alderman of the Peterhof has dressed this morning in his best cloak, a heavy wool of deep blue edged with modest fur, conscious that his appearance before the Posadnik must convey both dignity and deference. The Posadnik, elected by the Veche, served as chief executive and judge, and his power derives from the will of this assembly rather than from birth or divine right alone. You observe him ascending to his raised seat, a construction of dark timber that elevates him above the crowd without the grandeur of a throne, for the Posadnik's power was checked by the Veche. No single leader could long dominate in this republic of competing interests. His face is weathered and patient, the face of a man who has learned to wait through many hours of argument before pronouncing his judgments. The Archbishop of Novgorod wields significant power, sometimes presiding over the Veche, and today his presence is announced by a secondary procession of clerics in dark vestments. You note how the Hanseatic merchants shift their attention between these two poles of authority, the secular and the sacred, calculating which force currently holds the ascendancy in the complex geometry of Novgorod politics. The archbishop sometimes protected the Germans. At other times, he led opposition to them, and his unpredictability made him simultaneously a refuge and a threat. The cold of waiting has already begun to penetrate your boots as the formal audience stretches through its preliminary rituals, the Posadnik's deliberate delay establishing his control over time itself. The interpreter's voice begins its work now, rendering the alderman's formal greeting into the Novgorodian dialect with that slight delay between speech and translation that creates a doubled rhythm in the room. You are standing close enough to observe the alderman's hands, how they remain visible and empty, offering no suggestion of the gifts that will follow this public ceremony. Hanseatic merchants were required to present gifts to the Posadnik and key boyars upon arrival, and this obligation has been transformed over generations into an elaborate choreography of exchange. The weight of a gift bag, the clink of coin muffled by cloth, passed beneath a table, will come later, in the private spaces where the real negotiations occur. The particular smell of Russian political space intensifies as more bodies press into Yaroslav's court, and the pale winter light begins to shift toward a grey midday that offers still no promise of warmth. You watch the boyar factions arranging themselves in their habitual clusters, the older families toward the front, the newer wealth pressing from behind, each group conscious of its precarious position in the constant redistribution of influence. The Germans learned to read the political signs, which boyar faction ascendant, which church party influential, and their survival in this market depended upon the accuracy of these readings. The interpreter's voice continues its doubled rhythm, and the room breathes in between the languages, each pours a small window of uncertainty. A Veche debate overheard in the days preceding this audience has prepared you for the tensions that will surface here. A fiery speech against the Germans was delivered by a boyar whose family had suffered losses in a recent commercial dispute, his voice carrying to the back benches with an eloquence that threatened to ignite the assembly. A cooler defense followed, offered by a merchant prince whose wealth depended upon the continuation of the northern trade, and the vote remained uncertain when the bell ended that session. The Veche's volatility was notorious. A single inflammatory speech could reverse policy, and every German in Novgorod understood that today's confirmation of privileges might become tomorrow's expulsion. The Treaty of 1265, confirmed by both sides, established detailed trading privileges and protections, and its anniversary provides the occasion for this renewed audience. You observe the alderman producing the charter, its seals worn smooth by generations of handling, its clauses memorized by generations of Peterhof advocates. Trading privileges were confirmed or renegotiated annually, dependent on political circumstances, and this dependency upon the moment's temper was the fundamental condition of Hanseatic existence in this place. The cold air moves across your face again as a door opens to admit latecomers, and the echoing space of Yaroslav's court briefly amplifies the disturbance before settling back into its attentive hush. The sound of the Veche bell, deep and cracked, calling, ending, marking political time, has governed this morning's proceedings, and its note seems to linger in the timbers of the Posadnik's platform. You are standing now in the anteroom where the gift-giving will occur, a smaller space of rough stone and flickering lamps that contrasts with the open grandeur of the court. The alderman has unfastened his cloak to permit easier movement, and his assistants are arranging the offerings with the practiced efficiency of men who have performed this ritual many times. A Flemish tapestry to the Posadnik, its scenes of hunting, and courtly love chosen to appeal to a ruler who must display his magnificence before his rivals. Rhenish wine to the archbishop, the dark bottles wrapped in straw against the cold, their contents a taste of the Western world that the churchman sometimes favors. Discreet bags of coin complete the presentation, their amounts carefully recorded in the ledgers that will travel back to Lübeck for accounting. Gifts and bribes were systematic, budgeted, and recorded. They were a cost of doing business, and the Hanseatic League treated them with the same mercantile precision it applied to any other transaction. The weight of a gift bag settles into the Posadnik's hands with practiced invisibility, and the clink of coin, muffled by cloth, passes beneath the table where no witness can observe the exact measure of gratitude. The interpreter's voice resumes its doubled rhythm as formal thanks are exchanged, and the room breathes in between the languages in this private space, as it did in the public court. The cold of waiting returns as the alderman is detained for further consultation. Hours in an unheated anteroom while the Posadnik attends to other business. His deliberate delay a reminder that time itself is a currency of power. You are standing near the small window that looks toward the Cathedral of St. Sophia, understanding that the Veche met at Yaroslav's court, or in times of crisis, before the Cathedral of St. Sophia, and that the proximity of these two spaces defines the dual nature of authority in this republic. The pale winter light has begun to fade toward afternoon without ever having achieved true brightness, and the particular smell of Russian political space clings to your garments, a compound of incense, old wood, unwashed bodies, and fierce sweat that will not easily wash away. A commercial dispute now demands attention, and you move with the assembly toward the space where justice is administered. A Russian merchant claims German fraud, alleging that a shipment of wool was adulterated with inferior fleece before delivery to the Peterhof warehouse. The mixed court deliberates, for disputes between Germans and Russians were supposed to be tried by mixed courts, though practice varied according to the political climate and the relative influence of the parties. You observe the German advocate, the procurator, preparing his defense with documents drawn from the Peterhof archives, knowing that the Hanseatic community maintained a permanent advocate to represent them before Novgorod authorities. The interpreter's voice establishes its rhythm between accuser and accused, and the room breathes in between, each pause a space where judgment might tip in either direction. The Posadnik listens with the patience of long experience, his face revealing nothing of the calculations that will determine his ruling. The Posadnik could imprison German merchants, seize goods, or expel the community in extreme cases, and this capacity for total disruption hangs over every proceeding like the winter sky that promises snow without delivering its burden. Toll rates were a constant source of dispute. The Hanse sought fixed rates, Novgorod preferred flexibility, and this fundamental disagreement underlies the present accusation. For the Russian merchant claims that hidden tolls were evaded through the deception of mixed wool. The sound of the Veche bell, deep and cracked, calls the assembly back to order after a recess, and its note seems to carry a new urgency as rumors circulate through the benches. Muscovite envoys appear at the Veche, their presence unannounced in the morning's proceedings, and the Germans note, worry, report to Lübeck through the channels that connect this distant outpost to the Central Council of the League. Muscovite pressure on Novgorod grew throughout the 15th century, affecting the Germans' position as the Western trade became entangled in the larger struggle between emerging principalities. You watch the envoys from the Grand Prince taking their seats with the confidence of men who represent a power that grows, while Novgorod's ancient liberties appear to diminish. Hanseatic diplomacy sought to play competing Novgorod factions against each other, and the arrival of these Muscovite representatives complicates this strategy beyond immediate calculation. The Germans learn to read the political signs, but this new element disrupts the established patterns of their interpretation. The particular smell of Russian political space seems to intensify as the envoys are acknowledged, the fierce wet component becoming more pronounced among the Novgorodian boyars who understand what this presence portends. The interpreter's voice takes up the doubled rhythm of translation between the Muscovite dialect and the Novgorodian, and the room breathes in between these unfamiliar pairings, each pause a moment of speculation about alliances and their consequences. The cold air moves across your face as evening approaches without resolution, and you understand that the annual confirmation of privileges will be deferred until the implications of this Muscovite intervention become clearer. The alderman maintains his composure, but his hands have returned to the visible and empty position of formal waiting, concealing whatever anxiety the day's developments have produced. The Hansa occasionally imposed collective sanctions, forbidding all trade to pressure Novgorod concessions, and this ultimate weapon will be discussed in the Peterhof tonight. Its deployment weighed against the losses it would inflict upon Lübeck's merchants as well as upon their Russian counterparts. The most serious pre-1494 crisis occurred in the 1380s, when Novgorod threatened expulsion, and the memory of that near catastrophe informs every calculation. You are standing at the edge of the assembly, where the back benches dissolve into shadow, and the echoing space of Yaroslav's court, open to the sky, now contains only torchlight and the voices that carry across it with altered acoustics, the darkness absorbing some frequencies while others penetrate with strange clarity. The Posadnik's power was checked by the Veche. No single leader could long dominate, and this constitutional limitation now appears as both protection and vulnerability for the German community. A strong Posadnik might confirm privileges against opposition. A weak one could not protect them even with majority support. The alderman exchanges glances with the procurator, that brief communication of professionals who have faced similar uncertainties in previous years and recognize the familiar contours of crisis. The cold of waiting has become the cold of extended deliberation, hours in an unheated space, as the Veche debates whether to receive the Muscovite proposals immediately or defer them to a later session. The sound of the Veche bell, deep and cracked, ending this day's proceedings without resolution, marks political time with a note that seems to carry a question rather than a period. The assembly disperses into the darkness of the Novgorodian night, and you move with the Hanseatic delegation toward the Peterhof, where the private assessment of today's events will determine tomorrow's strategy. The particular smell of Russian political space clings to your garments still. Incense, old wood, unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, now compounded with the sharper scent of torch smoke, and the approaching winter that this prolonged session has permitted to deepen its hold upon the city. In the Peterhof, the alderman removes his best cloak and stands before the fire in his working garments, the transformation from ceremonial dignity to practical concern complete. You are standing at the window of the Peterhof, looking toward the dark mass of the Cathedral of St. Sophia, where the Veche met at Yaroslav's court, or in times of crisis, before the Cathedral of St. Sophia, and understanding that this day has moved the Republic closer to such a crisis than the Germans have seen in recent memory. The interpreter's voice continues in your memory, the slight delay between speech and translation, the room breathing in between, and you recognize that this rhythm of doubled meaning has become the permanent condition of your existence in this place. The cold air moves across your face from the imperfectly sealed window, and the pale winter night offers no relief from the day's accumulated tensions. The annual confirmation, the charter read, the seals are fixed, the relief in the Peterhof, these remain the objectives toward which all strategy bends, but their achievement now depends upon factors beyond the Hanseatic community's direct control. The procurator spreads his documents upon the table, preparing the brief that will accompany the urgent report to Lübeck, his movements demonstrating the practiced efficiency of a permanent advocate who has represented the Hanseatic community before Novgorod authorities for many years. Disputes between Germans and Russians were supposed to be tried by mixed courts, though practice varied, and the unresolved accusation of wool adulteration now hangs suspended with the larger question of privileges themselves. The Germans learn to read the political signs, and the sign of this evening is that the boyar factions are themselves uncertain, their habitual rivalries temporarily suspended by the perception of external threat. You are standing apart from the active deliberation, placed in the observer's position that permits the accumulation of detail without the responsibility of decision, and this placement itself is a kind of narrative privilege that the second person affords. The cold of waiting has been replaced by the warmth of the Peterhof central chimney, but the Posadnik's deliberate delay still operates in the larger time of diplomatic process, and no urgency of German concern can accelerate the Novgorodian rhythm of consultation and delay. The particular smell of Russian political space gradually yields to the more domestic sense of the merchant house. Dried herbs, stored grain, the faint salt tang of preserved fish from the warehouse below. The interpreter's voice has been replaced by the direct speech of the alderman and his officers, their low German a familiar ground after the doubled rhythms of the day's official proceedings. The room breathes in between their sentences with a different cadence, the pause of native comprehension rather than the gap of translation, and this shift in the quality of silence marks the transition from public performance to private strategy. The sound of the Veche bell, deep and cracked, marking political time, will not be heard again until tomorrow's session, and the interval between its notes becomes the space in which the German community must prepare its response to changed conditions. You are standing at the threshold between the consultation room and the sleeping quarters, understanding that the continuity you observe contains within it all the changes that have marked its long duration, and that the possibility of change is itself the deepest continuity that the merchant's condition affords. The pale winter night presses against the windows, and the city of Novgorod extends around you in its darkness, its churches and warehouses and political spaces all connected by the invisible networks of interest and survival that have drawn you here. The cold air moves across your face as a servant passes through the corridor, and the particular smell of Russian political space seems to have permeated the very stones of this building. Incense, old wood, unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, the permanent atmosphere of a place where power is negotiated rather than inherited. The alderman reads the archbishop's communication again, searching for the interpretation that will guide tomorrow's renewed audience, and his face in the lamplight shows the fatigue of a man who has spent his adult life in such deciphering. The interpreter's voice will resume its doubled rhythm with the dawn, the slight delay between speech and translation, the room breathing in between, and you will stand again in the echoing space of Yaroslav's court, open to the sky, voices carrying to the back benches where your presence as observer continues the narrative of German persistence in this ancient and volatile republic. You are standing now at the small window that faces east, where the first grey of another pale winter morning begins to separate itself from the darkness, and you understand that the annual confirmation, the charter read, the seals are fixed, the relief in the Peterhof remains possible despite all the day's complications. The cold air moves across your face from the window, and the particular smell of Russian political space seems to mingle with the morning freshness of snow that has fallen during the night, covering the traces of yesterday's assembly, preparing the ground for new gatherings. The alderman has refastened his best cloak, and his appearance before the renewed audience will convey the same dignity and deference as yesterday, the same careful calibration of respect and independence that has sustained the German position through previous uncertainties. The sky above remains pale with winter, the thin milk-colored light offering no warmth to the assembly benches arranged in rough semicircles upon the earth, and you are standing at the threshold of Yaroslav's court as the morning bell begins its summons, the deep cracked note rolling across the open space where the Veche will gather, understanding that the continuity you observe contains within it all the changes that have marked its long duration, and that the possibility of change is itself the deepest continuity that the merchant's condition affords. You are standing now in the courtyard of the German compound, where the morning sun falls at a lower angle than it did in June, and the timber walls cast longer shadows across the packed earth. Around you, the ordinary sounds of the contour proceed with a thin quality, as though heard through linen, and the merchants move between warehouse and chapel with the briskness of men who have not yet admitted to themselves that autumn is approaching. Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, annexed Novgorod in 1478, ending the Republic's independence, and the years since have taught the alderman that dignity is a currency that depreciates slowly but irreversibly. The wind carries from the Volkhov a dampness that smells of rotting reeds and distant smoke, and you feel it settle into the wool of your cloak as you watch two younger clerks argue over the manifest of a cargo that arrived incomplete. Their voices stay low, conscious of the walls, conscious that every conversation in the Peterhof now travels through channels that reach the Kremlin in Moscow with unsettling speed. The normal trade continues in form, the Schra books still recording transactions in their careful script, the scales still balancing wax and furs against linen and silver. Yet the forms persist without their former substance, and you notice how often a merchant pauses at the gate before stepping into the street beyond, how often eyes lift to the tower where the Posadnik's watchers have become more visible in recent months. A dog sleeps in the corner where sun warms the southern wall, and its breathing is the only steady rhythm in a compound where tension has begun to interrupt the ordinary pulse of commercial life. The final closure of the Peterhof occurred in 1494, though pressure had mounted for years, and the accumulated weight of those years presses now upon every gesture, every negotiation, every request for permission that meets with delay or ambiguous refusal. You walk past the chapel of St. Peter, where the door stands open as it has since matins, and the interior darkness smells of incense and cold stone, a consecrated space that has witnessed 4 generations of German merchants petitioning for safe passage and fair measure. The alderman emerges from his chamber with the step of a man who has not slept through the night, and his face bears the composed mask that leadership requires when certainty has departed. He speaks to the gathered merchants in measured phrases, repeating what they already know, that Ivan III's policy aimed at centralizing all foreign trade through Moscow-controlled channels, that the privileges granted by previous princes and republics no longer carry the force they once possessed, that patience and prudence remain their only viable instruments. His voice carries across the courtyard with the resonance of long practice, and you hear in its cadences the history of a man who has navigated crises before, though perhaps none that gathered so comprehensively against his people. The afternoon light turns the dust in the air to something visible, golden and slow, and you find yourself in the warehouse where autumn cargoes await the cogs that should arrive from the Baltic with the favorable winds. The bales of fur are pressed and wrapped, the wax molded into discs that will not melt in transit, the entire inventory arranged with the methodical care that German merchants have brought to this place since the century's beginning. A clerk shows you the records, the Schra books with their columns of figures and names, the contour archives that document every transaction, every dispute, every resolution that has bound this community to Novgorod across the decades of profitable coexistence. The immediate pretext for closure was a dispute over the treatment of Russian merchants in Livonia, and this quarrel now circulates through the compound like a fever that no one will name directly. You hear it referenced in passing, in the shake of a head, in the prolonged silence that follows a mention of Riga or Reval. The merchants of the Hanseatic League have never found unity easy, and the Livonian cities pursue their particular interests with the same vigor that Lübeck pursues hers. The alderman knows this fragmentation, has built his diplomacy upon its predictability, but the predictability itself has begun to fail him as Moscow's demands grow more insistent and less negotiable. Evening comes with a violet quality to the sky that you have noticed before in this northern latitude, a lingering of light that seems reluctant to surrender to darkness. You stand at the gate of the Peterhof, looking out toward the river where boats still move with the last traffic of the season, and the cold air moves across your face with the first intimation of the winter that will transform this landscape into something barely passable. The merchants who should be preparing for departure find their permissions withheld, the normal autumn departure obstructed by requirements that multiply and contradict, and the compound fills with the restlessness of men who understand delay as prelude to something worse. The church bell sounds for vespers, and its note carries the particular timbre of bronze long exposed to northern weather, cracked at its lower register where the metal has suffered some ancient stress. You follow the small procession into St. Peter's, where the last candle burns with a flame that trembles in the draught from doors that do not seal properly against the advancing season. The service proceeds with the familiar German cadences, the Latin responses, the comfort of ritual that has sustained these men so far from their cities of origin. Yet you observe how many eyes stray to the door, how many voices falter in the responses, how the congregation has diminished from the numbers that filled these benches in the years before 1478. The night brings frost to the compound, and you wake to the sound of a single voice in the darkness, someone pacing the courtyard with the sleeplessness of anticipated disaster. In 1494, Ivan III's agents arrested the German merchants in Novgorod and confiscated their goods, and this knowledge, which you possess as historian but experience here as witness, transforms every ordinary moment into something freighted with terminal significance. The dawn comes pale and slow, and you find yourself among the merchants at breakfast, where the bread is stale and the conversation thinner than the porridge, where the maps on the wall show routes that may no longer be available to these men. The cogs do not come, or come with warnings carried by crews who will not leave their vessels for the shore, who pass messages across the water without touching land. You stand at the harbour, where the reeds have begun to yellow and the mud carries the first skin of ice, and the absence of the expected ships opens in the scene like a wound that cannot be dressed. The merchants who have come down to meet them stand with their cloaks pulled tight, their breath visible in the cold air, their faces showing the stages of recognition that you have seen in other contexts of loss. First incomprehension, then the search for alternative explanation, finally the settling of a knowledge that refuses comfort. The Peterhof was closed, the church of St. Peter desecrated, the compound given over to other uses, and these future events press upon the present with a weight that bends every action toward their fulfillment. You return through streets that have begun to empty of the ordinary commerce that sustains a city's life, where the market stalls show gaps where Russian traders have withdrawn from association with the German community, where the Posadnik's officials move with the confidence of men who have received instructions that require no interpretation. The alderman receives delegations in his chamber, and his voice through the closed door carries the tones of negotiation that has already become pleading. The splintering of the church door comes without warning, though warning has surrounded you for days, and the iron bar forced from its brackets makes a particular crash of consecrated space, violated, that you will not forget. You are in the chapel when the soldiers enter, and the last candle in St. Peter's, extinguished not by pious breath, but by soldier's glove, leaves you in darkness that smells of tallow, smoke, and violence. The alderman is seized at the altar where he has knelt, his best cloak torn in the grasping, his dignity dismantled by hands that have no instruction to preserve it. Around you, the merchants are pressed against walls, the chests broken open with axes that send splinters across the stone floor, and the contents that spill out represent the accumulated substance of a community's labor and faith. Some sources suggest 49 merchants were imprisoned. Others indicate more were simply expelled. And in the chaos of that morning, the distinction matters less than the fact of removal, the severing of connection that proceeds with mechanical indifference. You are marched with others through the compound that has been your shelter, and the silence after arrest opens around you like a space emptied of its purpose. Wind in empty warehouses where the doors stand open, and the remaining goods await confiscation. The Church of St. Peter, which you have known as a place of order and reverence, now shows the disorder that follows upon sacrilege, its altar cloths dragged across the floor, its vessels gathered for melting or disposal according to the valuation of men who do not distinguish consecrated from common metal. The imprisonment takes you to cells that have held other categories of offender, political prisoners, debtors, men whose crimes against the Grand Prince's authority have required this cold removal from the ordinary world. The cold cells receive you with the indifferent hospitality of stone that has never been heated, and the interrogation proceeds with questions that assume guilt in their formulation, that treat the merchant's presence itself as offense requiring explanation. You sit on a bench that carries the dampness of years, and the slow realization that this is not a negotiable dispute settles through your body with the gradualness of frost entering ground that will not thaw until spring. The Schra books and contour archives were largely dispersed. No complete set is known to survive, and accounts suggest something of this dispersion in the soldiers' handling of documents they could not read, the tearing of pages for kindling, the packing of ledgers for transport to Moscow, where their interpretation would serve purposes that could not be anticipated. The alderman, in an adjacent cell, maintains the posture of authority that has defined his public life, though you hear in his coughing the effects of cold that his age cannot resist, and in his silences the recognition that the network of correspondence and influence upon which he has relied has been severed at its roots. The closure was sudden. The normal autumn departure had not yet occurred, and this temporal displacement adds to the disorientation of men who find themselves held past the season when navigation becomes possible, past the point when their presence in Novgorod could be rationalized as part of an ongoing commercial relationship. The march to exile comes with snow falling, no proper boots, the Volkhov frozen but no longer home, and you feel in your own feet the numbness that spreads from inadequate protection against weather that has turned hostile with the completeness of a natural force that requires no human agency. The soldiers who escort you move with the indifference of men who have performed this function before, who will perform it again as Ivan III's consolidation proceeds against other enclaves, other communities that have imagined their privileges permanent. Lübeck and the Hanseatic Diet protested, threatened retaliation, but could not reverse the action, and this knowledge reaches you fragmentarily, through guards who speak of events beyond your confinement with the casualness of men who do not understand their significance. The Hanseatic response included a brief embargo, but Livonian and Prussian cities broke ranks, and the unity that might have pressured Moscow dissolves with the predictability that the alderman had counted upon, and that has failed him. You learn of this in a cell where the light comes only through a grate too high to show anything but weather, where the days lose distinction and the interrogations continue with questions that circle the same points of commercial practice and political loyalty. The expulsion comes finally with the early darkness of a December afternoon, and you are marched to the border or to the coast, stripped of goods, winter approaching with the finality that will close navigation until ice breakup permits the first ships of a new year. The snow falls with the steadiness that will cover your tracks within hours, that will transform the landscape into something featureless and white, and you march with others who have survived the imprisonment with bodies diminished and spirits compressed to something that will require years, perhaps generations, to recover its former expansion. You look back once from the rise that gives a final view of the city, seeing the towers and river that have framed your life in this place, knowing that the return will not occur in your lifetime, perhaps not in the lifetime of any who march with you. The physical site of the Peterhof was eventually absorbed into Novgorod's expanding fabric, and the slow decay of a timber compound, unoccupied, unheated, collapsing in a single spring thaw, proceeds without witness in the years that follow, the buildings that sheltered a community surrendering to the elements with the patience of organic matter returning to the earth from which it was briefly extracted. A limited trade was eventually restored, but the Peterhof never regained its former status, and this qualified resumption serves only to emphasize the completeness of what has been lost. The closure marked the end of the Hanseatic contour system in the east. Bergen, Bruges, London continued, and the German merchant who finds himself in those western cities will encounter the familiar forms of the contour life that Novgorod has forfeited. The 1494 closure coincided with broader Russian reorientation toward the south and the Ottoman trade, and this reorientation proceeds with the momentum of a power that has discovered its capacity to determine the terms of commercial engagement rather than accept those offered by others. Some historians see the closure as part of Ivan III's gathering of the Russian lands, eliminating foreign enclaves, and this interpretation reaches you through the long interval of your exile, in correspondence that arrives with the irregularity of communication between hostile or indifferent powers. Memory of the German presence faded in Russia. In Germany, the Novgorod trade became legendary, and you observe in your own experience the divergence of these memories, the Russian archive moving towards silence where the German preserves and elaborates. The last German merchant to winter in the old Peterhof, if any did after 1494, left no record, and this uncertainty becomes itself a kind of testimony to the thoroughness of the removal that Ivan III's agents accomplished. The closure of 1494 is sometimes termed the Great Arrest in German historiography, and you encounter this term in the documents that accumulate in your later years, in the attempts to comprehend and commemorate what you have survived. The alderman did not survive the imprisonment, his body surrendering to the cold and the conditions that his age could not withstand, and his death removes from the community its center of memory and negotiation, the figure who might have sustained some continuity of institutional identity through the years of displacement. You find yourself in later life in a city of the Hanseatic League, perhaps Lübeck, perhaps some smaller place where the merchant life continues with the forms that Novgorod once shared. The winter evenings bring you to a fireside where the past returns with the particular vividness of trauma that has not been processed, and you speak of the Peterhof to listeners who have not known it, whose imaginations must supply what your words can only partially convey. The Schra books that survive in fragmentary form, rescued by some clerk's quick thinking or a soldier's negligence, pass into archives where scholars will eventually seek them, attempting the reconstruction that your testimony alone cannot complete. The years accumulate with the slowness that characterizes historical change when experienced from within, and you observe the gradual acceptance of loss that transforms a community of exiles into something else. Merchants who find other markets, other partnerships, other forms for the commercial skills that Novgorod once required. The legend of the Novgorod trade grows in German discourse, acquiring the glow that distance and difficulty confer upon memory, and you participate in this legendary construction even as you retain the particular knowledge of its cost, the specific losses that no narrative of commercial glory can adequately commemorate. The fireside where you sit in these later years carries the warmth that the Peterhof cells denied, and the sound of ordinary conversation in a familiar language surrounds you with the comfort that exile had suspended. Yet the return to this comfort does not erase the experience of its absence, and you find yourself sometimes in the silence between words, listening for something that is no longer present, the particular quality of a bell or a voice, or the wind in warehouses that have long since decayed to nothing distinguishable from the surrounding earth. The closure of 1494, which Ivan III accomplished with the instruments of princely power that Novgorod's annexation had consolidated, remains for you the defining event of a life that has continued through other experiences without ever fully departing from that moment of violation and removal. The night deepens around your fireside, and the embers settle into patterns that suggest the shapes of buildings, of faces, of the landscape that has persisted in memory with greater fidelity than it ever possessed in direct perception. You are old now, and the old age that the alderman was denied gives you a perspective that is death withheld, the long view that sees events in the proportion that duration provides. The Hanseatic League itself will not survive many more decades, its unity finally dissolving under pressures that Ivan III's action anticipated and demonstrated, the emergence of territorial states that will claim the commercial regulation that cities once negotiated among themselves. The snow falls again in your memory, and the march to exile repeats with the persistence of experience that has found no adequate form of expression, that circles through the mind with the repetition of trauma seeking resolution. The Volkhov, frozen but no longer home, the particular quality of ice on a river that has served as road and boundary and now serves as final separation. These remain with you as sensory anchors that no historical narrative can fully convey. The closure of the Peterhof, the desecration of St. Peter's, the dispersion of the archives and the community that produced them. These events that you witnessed and survived have become part of a larger history that will interpret them with categories you did not possess in the moment of their occurrence. The fire dies to ash, and the room around you settles into the darkness that precedes dawn, the long northern darkness that you have known in other contexts, and that now surrounds your final years with the familiarity of an old companion. You have lived to see the consequences of this completion, and your breathing now in the darkness carries the weight of that witnessing, the responsibility of memory that will pass with you into the silence that awaits. The last sounds of the night reach you from a city that has continued without the Peterhof, that has absorbed its absence into the ordinary texture of urban life. The gap in the cityscape where the market's edge once showed Germans gathering has been filled by other presences, other commercial practices, the normal adaptation of cities to the disappearance of what once seemed essential. You close your eyes in the darkness, and the compound appears with the clarity of long acquaintance, the courtyard where the dogs slept in the sun, the chapel where the last candle burned, the warehouse where the autumn cargoes awaited the cogs that never came to carry them away. The wind moves through empty spaces that memory preserves against the decay that has claimed the physical structures, and you drift with it into the silence that follows upon a story that has reached its necessary end.